In the earliest age of mankind, before Terra bore the name Earth as we know it, before the galaxy trembled with the tread of titans or the chanting of space marines, humanity was scattered, primitive, and fragile. Civilizations had not yet risen, empires had not yet fallen, and the stars were distant, unknowable lights in the night sky. But even in this deep prehistory, older than any written word or fossilized ruin, something was stirring. This was the age before history, when mankind had only just begun to understand fire, to shape tools, to hunt in coordinated bands. Tribes wandered across harsh continents, clinging to survival. Yet, even amid this struggle, strange individuals walked among them, figures that whispered truths into the ears of hunters and shamans, seeding the roots of myth. These were the earliest psychers, those gifted with a connection to the Imperium, the warp. They were not mutants in the way the Imperium would come to understand, but visionaries, spiritualists, and mystics. They believed they were communing with the spirits of nature or ancestral gods. In truth, they were peering into the formless, swirling madness of the warp, where thought and emotion could take shape. These early psychers were the forerunners of all who would come to know the warp, and among them a group emerged that understood a terrible truth. The Imperium was not only alive but hungry. As mankind's psychic presence grew, it drew the attention of ancient, predatory entities that dwelled in the warp, primordial intelligences later known as the Chaos Gods. To protect humanity from this growing danger, these mystics, shamans of every region and race, gathered in secret. Their council spanned continents, bound together by shared visions and psychic communion. They saw what others could not, that the rise of chaos would eventually corrupt or consume humanity. No tribal power or material weapon would be enough to stop it. They needed something more, something eternal. And so they made a choice. According to the most ancient and suppressed accounts preserved only in fragments, later forbidden and buried deep within the Black Library and scattered human records, these thousands of shamans sacrificed themselves in a monumental psychic ritual. Each one chose death willingly, allowing their souls to pass through the Imperium and coalesce in a single vessel. The reincarnation of all their knowledge, all their power, and all their will. The outcome was a child born somewhere in the cradle of Anatolia, or possibly on the plains of Mesopotamia, around the 8th millennium before the Common Era. A boy, biologically human, but something utterly unique. This child would become known as the Emperor of Mankind. From the moment of his birth, he was different. He never spoke of his name, never recorded it, and perhaps it was lost to time deliberately. The boy was surrounded by omens, natural harmony, unnatural calm, and animals behaving with strange obedience. He grew faster, thought more deeply, and moved more deliberately than any of his kin. Those who met him were drawn to his presence, as though sensing a gravity in his soul. He did not age as others did. Death did not touch him, and he watched. For decades, then centuries, the Emperor lived among humanity, always in disguise, always adapting. He did not declare himself a god, nor reveal his nature. Instead, he observed, he learned languages, customs, the patterns of civilization and war. He saw mankind invent the wheel, discover agriculture, raise cities, and tear them down in fire. He saw the emergence of hierarchy, tyranny, cruelty, and greed, and in each cycle of peace and conflict he studied. There are accounts, now deeply mythologized, that the emperor walked among the Sumerians, the early Egyptians, the Vedic kings, even the builders of Machu Picchu and the ziggurats of Ur. Some say he took the role of teacher, guiding mortals toward justice or balance. Others say he was a warlord, a lawgiver, or a sage. In every case, he left little behind. No temples bore his name. No armies carried his sigil. Yet his influence stretched across cultures and continents. One tale preserved in the Book of the Astronomicon speaks of the emperor leading a forgotten people across a vast desert, teaching them laws and unity. Another, from a later corrupted version of imperial truth doctrine, claims he lived briefly as a healer among plague-ridden tribes in the East, ending entire pandemics with nothing more than his hands and will. Whether these are literal truths or symbolic echoes of his nature, they all point to the same idea. He was present during humanity's most formative moments, but he was not omnipotent. Even in those ages, the Emperor saw what he could not yet defeat, the creeping influence of the warp. Primitive cults began to emerge, devoted to bloodshed, to excess, to despair. Whispered prayers began feeding the embryonic chaos gods who stirred in their formless slumber. The Emperor, immortal though he was, understood that his time to act openly had not yet come. The galaxy was still too wild. Humanity was not yet ready. So he waited. For over 30,000 years, the Emperor maintained this hidden guardianship. He moved among kings and slaves, philosophers and generals. He watched empires rise and fall. Akkad, Babylon, Carthage, the Qin dynasty, Rome. In each, he nudged events, sometimes promoting enlightenment, sometimes bringing about collapse. But always with a long vision in mind. He was not trying to create a perfect civilization in one lifetime. He was preparing humanity itself. This period, the silent millennia when the Emperor walked in shadow, is sometimes called the Hidden Age or the Ghost Years by certain esoteric Terran historians. Forbidden sects of the Adeptus Mechanicus claim that this was when the Emperor encoded the principles of logic and science that would later become the STC systems of the Dark Age of technology. Others whisper that he tested proto-versions of his gene-crafting techniques on isolated populations, quietly beginning the long process that would later produce the Primarchs and the Legions Astartes. But during this time, he never declared his hand. He was the architect behind the curtain, the guardian in silence, the first bulwark against the warp, and the only hope that humanity might survive what he knew was coming. By the time the Age of Strife would tear the galaxy apart in blood and madness, the Emperor would be ready to step forward. But that moment was still millennia away. For now, in the still dark ages before Terra knew its fate, the Emperor walked alone, preparing the path that would one day lead to an empire of 1,000,000 worlds, all forged in his name. But in the beginning there was only the world, and the one who would one day rule it. There are moments in human prehistory so monumental, so vast in scale and significance, that they defy all classification. This chapter, The Birth of the Emperor, is one such moment. It is not merely the origin of a man. It is the beginning of a force, a singular intelligence forged by deliberate sacrifice and millennia of forethought. It is the only known instance in human lore where thousands chose death so that one being might rise, not out of desperation or fear, but with absolute clarity of purpose. To understand what happened, we must return to a forgotten age, a time before the warp was widely known or named, before the chaos gods had coalesced into true power, before mankind had even reached the stars. This was the Paleolithic twilight of human existence, yet even in this ancient time, the warp whispered. It began with the shamans. They were the most spiritually attuned of early humanity, men and women across every tribe, continent, and forgotten civilization. These were not religious leaders in the modern sense. They were natural-born psychers, gifted with a connection to the immaterium long before it was understood. They could perceive the world beyond the material, spirits, omens, dreams that foretold events yet to come. Their talents were feared, revered, and often misunderstood. At first, they used these powers to guide and protect. A shaman might avert a hunt gone wrong by reading visions in smoke, or heal the sick by channeling unseen energy. But over generations they began to sense a change, something darker. The warp, once a realm of raw possibility, began to twist. It was subtle at first. Visions became clouded with images of fire and war. Nightmares plagued their sleep. Shadows with no source flickered at the edge of ritual fires. They soon realized the truth. Something malignant was gestating within the warp. Negative human emotions, rage, lust, despair, and ambition were not merely energies. They were becoming beings. The shamans felt them watching. Names were not yet known: Korn, Slanesh, Nurgle, Tsainch. But the essences were forming, and they were hungry. When a shaman died, their soul would pass through the warp. In previous centuries, they had reincarnated, reborn in time among their people. But now, those who died did not return. Their spirits were consumed, torn apart in the immaterium. The cycle of rebirth was broken. Fear rippled through the global network of shamans. They had no technology. They had no unified language. Yet across vast distances, they connected through their minds, sharing their dread. What they feared most was not just the loss of their power, but that humanity itself would be corrupted, destroyed, or enslaved by what now stirred beyond the veil. And so a plan was formed, a decision unparalleled in the history of any species. Over 100,000 of the most powerful shamans, some so old their names were already myth, gathered for a final ritual. It was not done in one place, but simultaneously, in secret across the globe. They had come to one conclusion: they would surrender their lives, not in defeat, but in union. Their souls would be woven into a single being, a vessel who could withstand the warp, resist the temptations of chaos, and lead humanity not as a prophet, but as its immortal protector. Each shaman died by their own hand. Some drank poison. Others entered the warp in meditative trance, never to return. A few simply willed themselves to die, their psychic essence unraveling like threads into a vast, luminous tapestry. Across every continent, as the stars shifted, the shamans passed from the material world, and in that moment, a child was born. His name is lost, if he ever had one, but his nature was entirely new. He was not merely psychic. He was the distillation of all psychic understanding humanity had ever known. He possessed the minds, memories, and souls of tens of thousands. Not as voices in his head, not as influences, but as foundation. He was them, and more. Unlike any other psyker, he had complete control over his power. From infancy, he did not cry, did not hunger in the way others did. He was self-aware. He remembered the ritual. He understood his purpose. He did not emerge in glory. There were no thunderclaps or celestial signs. He was born in a small, anonymous village, likely somewhere in central Anatolia, though even this is debated. His mother, a simple woman, is unrecorded. His father's name has never been known. They raised him as best they could, never fully understanding what they had brought into the world. The child never aged like others. He grew in strength, in mind and body, with terrifying speed. By the time he reached his first decade, he was indistinguishable from an adult, taller, sharper of speech, and gifted beyond comprehension. He began experimenting with his abilities in secret. He could move objects without touching them, see through lies, heal wounds with a gesture. But he also witnessed his world suffering, disease, warfare, ignorance, and resolved not to rule through miracles, but to guide. This self-imposed restraint would define his early existence. He knew that to be worshipped too soon would be to derail humanity's development. He knew that to reveal the truth of chaos before humanity was ready would only feed its power. So he adopted the ancient principle of non-intervention, but not inaction. From adolescence to adulthood, the Emperor traveled. He did not travel as a king nor as a warrior, but as a man among men. He studied, he observed, he helped when he could, sometimes healing, sometimes teaching. He spoke dozens of languages by the time he reached his second decade. By his third, he had already lived through the rise and fall of minor city-states. Yet he remained hidden, watching as mankind crawled forward. His mind remained utterly disciplined. The countless souls within him, those of the shamans, had not splintered his will. Rather, they had merged into one identity, patient, analytical, benevolent, yet prepared for ruthless action when necessary. He began cataloging early threats to humanity, not just from within, but from beyond. Ancient alien races moved in the stars. The warp churned with growing danger. But the Emperor did not yet intervene. He waited. In those days, there were few records, only oral histories, songs, and myths. And yet, if one looks carefully through the ancient religious texts and heroic epics of dozens of cultures, one finds common motifs. A golden-eyed stranger who healed the sick, overthrew tyrants, or vanished into the mountains after teaching people the ways of peace. Scholars of forbidden knowledge have identified over 100 such figures, spanning a 5,000-year period, all matching the description of one man. It is likely that these were not metaphors or coincidences. They were echoes, residual memories of a being who moved through humanity's earliest history like a whisper, never staying long, never drawing attention to himself, always watching. The shamans who died to create him did not give rise to a god. They created something more dangerous, a man with a purpose, one who would walk the long path alone in the face of cosmic annihilation. The Emperor had been born not by accident, but by choice, and the galaxy would never be the same. He walked among them unnoticed, not because he lacked presence. On the contrary, those who looked into his golden eyes often hesitated, struck by a brief, inexplicable reverence, but because he willed it. From the earliest years of his conscious existence, the Emperor understood the power of remaining unseen. He knew he was different, but he chose to live as if he were not. This chapter of his existence was neither glorious nor dramatic. There were no armies, no science fiction grandeur, no divine declarations. The Emperor, in this early period of his life, lived quietly, purposefully, among shepherds and farmers, among traders and stonemasons. For all his power, he chose to walk as a child of Terra, of Earth, so he could understand it not as a god, but as one of its own. The region where he matured was rugged, sun-drenched, and ancient, possibly within the Anatolian highlands or the early Fertile Crescent, though scholars can only speculate. Its people were superstitious but practical, bound by tribal laws, kinship, and survival. The Emperor was raised as any child was, taught to tend animals, gather roots, avoid predators. But while others learned through mistakes, he never needed to. His mind was already vast beyond human comprehension, filled with the aggregated experience and memory of thousands of long-dead shamans. Even so, he did not rule over others, nor did he attempt to impress. He worked alongside the people. He shared their food. He listened to their concerns. And quietly, he studied. One of his earliest observations was the tension between will and ignorance. He watched as tribal leaders abused their influence, not out of malice, but from fear of the unknown. Superstition led to cruelty. Disease was mistaken for a curse. The birth of a deformed child became a death sentence. When rains did not come, the people blamed their neighbors, and war followed. It was in these patterns of fear and reaction that the Emperor saw his first real challenge, the nature of man. Not just humanity's ignorance, but its emotional volatility. Mankind was a species of duality, capable of abstract thought, philosophy, and compassion, yet equally prone to vengeance, brutality, and submission to blind faith. The Emperor understood this intrinsically. But understanding was not the same as excusing. At night, under starlit skies, he would sit alone and ponder. He did not dream as others did. His psychic mind was too controlled. But in meditation, he would peer into the warp, observing its endless churn of emotion and reflection. Even then, it was not fully corrupted, still largely unshaped, but currents of pain and longing flowed freely. He realized that every violent death, every betrayal, every act of terror rippled through the immaterial like drops into an infinite ocean. The warp fed on these things, and so the Emperor knew he could not simply teach humanity to be kind. He had to lead it toward mastery of itself. The alternative was extinction, or worse. His first recorded act of judgment in this early stage of his life came not from anger, but from necessity. The story survives in multiple fragmented oral traditions, none mentioning him by name, but all aligning in detail. A man, likely his uncle or local chieftain, had murdered the emperor's father in secret. There was no justice to be found, no formal law, only the rule of the strong. No one dared confront the murderer, who had since taken the emperor's mother as his own and ruled the tribe with harsh, erratic cruelty. The emperor, still appearing no older than a youth, did not cry out for vengeance. He did not raise a hand. He simply stood before the man one morning and said a single word. No one remembers what that word was, only that, upon hearing it, the man's heart stopped in his chest. He fell dead instantly, as if the world itself had declared judgment. There were gasps, fear, awe, but the emperor said nothing more. He did not seize power. He did not offer explanation. He returned to work that day as though nothing had happened. In that moment, the tribe began to whisper of him. Not with fear, but something closer to reverence. He was not like the rest of them. He never had been. The emperor's travels began shortly after. Whether he was cast out or left by his own will is unclear, but he wandered far from his birthplace and never returned. For the next several centuries, though his body aged with glacial slowness, he walked the earth in solitude. Everywhere he went, he embedded himself within the local people. He studied languages long since forgotten. He participated in rites and rituals that predated the gods of modern civilization. He joined builders raising monoliths to the stars, aided in the creation of irrigation systems, and healed plague victims in pestilence-stricken cities. He learned their myths and saw how they distorted reality, how stories twisted over generations, how easily power fed delusion. One recurring theme troubled him: the people's need to externalize meaning. They created gods to explain storms, earthquakes, and death. They sacrificed to these gods, sometimes animals, sometimes neighbors. And those who spoke to the gods, or claimed to, held sway over all others. The emperor saw the seeds of chaos in this, not the warp entities themselves, not yet, but the behaviors and beliefs that would one day feed them. Humanity's craving for authority, for certainty in a chaotic world, would make it vulnerable to false salvation. So he began to intervene. Gently at first, in one city he exposed a fraudulent oracle whose poison-based visions had led to the deaths of dozens. In another, he taught a farmer to inoculate his livestock, sparking a chain of agricultural reform. In a distant land, he guided a young woman to overthrow a tyrant and become her people's first lawmaker. He never claimed credit. Names changed, records faded, but the impact remained. There is a tale from this period that survives in a heavily redacted Mechanicus archive. It speaks of a lone traveler who entered a village stricken by war. The two rival factions had spent generations killing one another over a holy relic, a stone said to have fallen from the heavens, shaped like a crescent moon. The traveler examined it and declared it to be nothing more than ancient obsidian. Then he shattered it with a touch, reducing it to dust. At first, the villagers prepared to kill him, but he simply sat and waited. Eventually, without their divine cause, the factions had nothing left to fight over. Peace followed, not because of a sermon, but because of a void. This was the Emperor's way in these early centuries, subtle, surgical, always assessing the consequences of his actions. But he was not without flaws. His detachment even then set him apart. He could empathize with humans intellectually, but not emotionally. He understood their desires, fears, and needs, but never truly felt them as they did. He did not mourn, he did not rejoice. He observed and calculated. That detachment grew over time. With each year, he grew more distant from the people he tried to help. His interventions became rarer. His trust in individuals diminished. Still, he continued to study, to build a mental map of mankind's psychological and social patterns. By now, he had lived several lifetimes. He no longer thought in years or decades, but in centuries. And all the while the warp stirred, the shadows thickened, the dreams of seers and prophets across the world darkened with strange symbols, spirals, open mouths, bleeding suns. Cults began to form at the edges of civilization. Sacrifices returned, and with them the Emperor's sense of urgency deepened. He realized that observation alone would no longer suffice. Action would be required, calculated, large-scale action. But the world was not yet ready. So he waited, he prepared, and in silence he began to design. Not miracles, but mechanisms, not temples, but tools. He would need an empire not of gold or faith, but of order and knowledge. But to build it, he would need the stars, and that too would take time. The child had grown. The architect was waking, and Terra, still primitive and fractured, had no idea that the man walking beside them was already planning to save their future, or, if need be, to control it. There comes a moment in every myth where the mask of peace slips, where potential becomes power, and quiet restraint gives way to decisive action. For the Emperor, that moment came not in war or glory, but in blood, in the death of a single man. The tale survives only in fragments. What records we have are passed down as whispers in the margins of forgotten tomes, too old to be verifiable, too consistent to ignore. The accounts vary in name and setting, but one detail never changes. A young man with golden eyes stood over a corpse, untouched and expressionless, while those around him watched in silence. This is the story of the murdered uncle. The Emperor had been living with a small tribe in a rugged, windswept region, likely a Proto-Anatolian settlement nestled in harsh foothills. The tribe was ruled by a council of elders, one of whom was a man of some influence. This elder was the Emperor's relative, some say an uncle by blood, others a father figure of circumstance. He was not a cruel man by appearance. He was respected, a provider, a voice in disputes. But underneath that mask he was jealous, afraid, and dangerous. The Emperor's father, a quiet and honorable man by most accounts, had grown wary of the elder's growing influence. There had been disagreements about food storage, seasonal migration, and interactions with rival clans. The young Emperor, then still appearing no older than a boy on the cusp of manhood, was perceptive beyond his years. He had noticed tension brewing. He said nothing, but he watched. One morning, the Emperor's father did not return from the river. His body was found in the reeds, throat cut cleanly. The tribe mourned, but suspicion was brief. The elder, his own brother, took the Emperor's mother into his household within the week, under the guise of protection. No one questioned him. Power has a way of cloaking guilt. But the boy knew. He had seen the future in dreams and had already walked the labyrinth of this timeline 1,000 times in his mind. He did not rage. He did not grieve in the way others did. He prepared. What came next would be a moment of choice, not just for the murderer, but for the Emperor himself. Until this point, he had intervened in human affairs only in whispers, adjusting outcomes, not enforcing them. But this act, the betrayal and murder of his father, was not just a personal loss. It was a mirror of what he had seen across the world, men killing for power, twisting law to serve ambition, cloaking brutality in ritual. This uncle was not the first man to kill his kin for influence. He was a symptom of a deeper disease. And the emperor, now truly aware of what he was, understood the lesson. Words do not reform the corrupt. Only consequence does. The confrontation was simple. The boy approached the fire circle where the elders gathered each morning. The killer sat beside the hearth, speaking softly to another, sharing smoked meat. The emperor said nothing at first. He simply stood there. His presence stilled the air. One by one, voices faltered and turned to him. He walked to the center of the circle, looked directly at the man who had taken his father's life, and spoke. Accounts vary on the exact word or phrase. Some say it was the man's true name, spoken aloud for the first time since childhood. Others claim it was a word in a forgotten tongue, an ancient command with no translation. Whatever it was, it struck with the force of judgment itself. The elder froze, eyes wide, hand clutching at his chest. He collapsed, dead before he hit the earth. No blood, no wound, simply stopped. The fire crackled. The tribe was silent, and the boy turned and walked away. There was no trial, no punishment, no revenge, only an end. And in that instant, the emperor demonstrated something profound. He would not tolerate corruption, not even in his own blood. Power, he had learned, must be wielded with precision. Mercy can become weakness, and justice delayed is often justice denied. What no one in that tribe knew, what they could not have known, was that this moment would echo across millennia. The emperor did not kill out of rage. He killed to test a principle. Could a single surgical action correct a moral imbalance? Could judgment, clean and swift, set a standard for the future? This was the emperor's earliest known execution, but it would not be his last. The psychological weight of this act on the emperor is difficult to assess. He did not weep. He did not isolate himself. In the days that followed, he resumed his duties as if nothing had changed. But inside, something had crystallized. He had acted as judge, jury, and executioner. He had exercised power over life and death without hesitation and found he could bear it. This is not to say he was without emotion, but his mind, forged from thousands of psychic fragments, understood that leadership sometimes requires severance, the surgical removal of a single diseased limb to save the whole body. In this man, his uncle, his father's killer, the emperor had found a limb already rotting, and so he removed it. After this, the emperor began to distance himself from the tribe, not because they rejected him, but because he no longer belonged among them. He had passed through a threshold where once he had been content to learn and observe, he now saw the need for shaping, guiding, for control, if not by direct rule, then by force of will and moral example. It was around this time that stories began to spread beyond the tribe. A boy with golden eyes who could kill with a word, a youth who judged the hearts of men and walked away from power, a wanderer who knew your name before you spoke it. Most of these tales would fade into legend, but they formed the early mythology of the figure who would one day be known as the master of mankind. But he did not stay to bask in myth. He left the tribe within a season, traveling east into the mountains. There he encountered new peoples, nomads and scholars, mystics and warriors. He studied their beliefs, their structures of governance, their concepts of justice, and he began to see patterns repeating. In every society, the same flaws emerged: greed, fear, domination. Every village had its tyrant, every city its conspiracies, every empire its ambition. He watched as power corrupted. He watched as fear turned to faith, and faith to fanaticism. The uncle's act of murder was not a unique betrayal. It was a microcosm of mankind's self-destructive cycle, and the Emperor, more than ever, understood his role to break that cycle, not through terror, not through miracles, but through design. This moment, his first personal loss, his first deliberate execution, was the seed. From it would grow an entire philosophy, that humanity could not be left to drift, that order must be imposed, that justice must be absolute, swift, and without favor. He would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his existence, and the galaxy, when the time came, would learn it too. While empires rose and fell under the weight of bronze, iron, and fire, another war raged unnoticed, unwritten by historians, unseen by kings. It was a war not for land or gold, but for the future soul of humanity. This conflict, whispered only in the most ancient myths and preserved in warped echoes through forbidden texts, was not fought with legions or siege engines. It was fought in minds, in rituals, in silence, and at its center moved a solitary figure, the one who would one day be known as the Emperor of Mankind, fighting battles no one else could even perceive. This was not the war for Terra. That would come much later. These were the first wars in the shadows, a clandestine campaign against a threat far more insidious than any mortal tyrant, the slow and creeping corruption of the warp. By now, centuries had passed since the Emperor's birth. Though appearing to age slowly, his mind had long outgrown the need to live as a tribal youth. He had walked across deserts and forests, lived among early city builders and wandering sages. He had studied cultures, observed primitive belief systems, and measured the heartbeat of human civilization. And everywhere he looked, he found a terrifying constant. Humanity's psychic nature was awakening, but without understanding, without discipline, and without defense. Across Terra, scattered cults began to emerge. They were not yet the great chaos-worshipping covens that would one day defile entire worlds. These were subtle, fractured, often short-lived, but they shared common traits, visions, blood rites, violent trances, sacrifices. Some believed they worshipped spirits of the harvest or ancestors. Others spoke of gods of pain, ecstasy, or change. The names were different, but the energies were the same. They were calling into the immaterium, and something was beginning to answer. The Emperor understood what these cults did not. The warp was reflective. It did not simply receive thought and emotion. It gave form to it. Every ritual, every fevered dream, every act of cruelty committed in belief became a brushstroke painting something ancient into being. He had witnessed this pattern before, thousands of years ago, when the shamans, sensing the warp's danger, had sacrificed themselves to create him. Now, he was seeing the consequences of inaction. Humanity's ignorance was not static, it was fertile ground for corruption. The first gods of chaos were no longer mere shadows. They were coalescing. They stirred at the edge of thought. The Emperor had no names for them yet, but he could feel their nature, and he knew, if left unchecked, they would devour mankind before it ever reached the stars. So he began to fight, not as a warlord and not yet as a ruler, but as a hidden hand moving silently through the world, extinguishing sparks before they could become infernos. He began with observation. For decades at a time, he would infiltrate these early cults, disguised as a disciple, a mystic, a humble initiate. He would earn their trust, study their rites, map their psychic patterns, and when he was certain, absolutely certain, they had made contact with the warp, he would act. Sometimes it was a single word spoken during a ritual, unraveling the entire psychic structure and leaving the cultists comatose. Other times he would turn the leaders against each other, fracturing their hierarchy into collapse. In more desperate situations, he resorted to direct intervention, unleashing waves of psychic force that erased entire gatherings from existence, leaving only ash and scorched earth behind. None of these events were recorded in contemporary texts. To the locals, they were inexplicable tragedies, earthquakes, sicknesses, divine wrath. But they were surgical strikes, designed to protect humanity from knowledge it wasn't ready to possess. It is said that during one such operation, in the mountains of what would become Tibet, the Emperor encountered a proto-sect that had accidentally opened a warp breach. The Sky Wound, as they called it, bled light and shadow. The cult believed it to be a gateway to their ancestors, but what poured through were not spirits. They were warp entities, unformed demons, instinctive and ravenous. The Emperor sealed the breach, not with ritual, but with will alone. He stood before it, arms outstretched, and spoke in a language that had not yet been invented. The portal closed like a lid over an eye. Those who had summoned it were left with their minds broken, unable to speak again. This was the scale of the war he fought. As the years became centuries, his understanding deepened. He realized the warp could not be avoided. It was a constant, a part of the human condition. Emotion, thought, memory, all echoed there. The warp was not evil by nature. It was raw potential, shaped by sentience, and this was what made it dangerous. As long as humanity remained fragmented, irrational, and ruled by fear, it would feed the worst parts of itself into the immaterium. The gods of chaos were not alien invaders, they were human consequences. But the Emperor also saw a solution: discipline. If he could teach humanity to control its emotions, to regulate its beliefs, to unify its thinking, not through dogma but through truth, he could cut off the food supply of chaos at its source. A rational species would create a stable warp, and a stable warp could be mastered, not feared. But this ideal was far from realization. The first wars in the shadows stretched over continents and cultures. In the swamp cities of early Mesoamerica, the Emperor confronted sun cults that practiced ritual sacrifice to sustain the light. In the deserts of pre-dynastic Egypt, he battled proto-sorcerers who had learned to bind psychic echoes into living stone. On the icy fringes of what would become Scandinavia, he dismantled a brotherhood that spoke with the voices of the frost, later revealed to be nascent demonic manifestations. He never raised an army. He needed none. His mind was a fortress, his soul a weapon. He moved like a shadow through centuries, unaging, unshaken. In his wake, mysteries were born, myths of star-eyed strangers, of judgment without warning, of healers who left no footprints. But not all threats were primitive. In the East, the Emperor encountered an off-world entity, possibly a stranded Xenos psyker, or a remnant of a long-extinct race. This being had cloaked itself in worshippers and was subtly guiding their evolution, using their psychic potential to siphon power. It is said the confrontation between them lasted 3 days, locked not in combat, but in a war of minds, consciousness against consciousness. The Emperor won, but barely. It was here that he began developing psychic disciplines, early prototypes of what would one day become librarius training, or even the techniques of the Grey Knights. These practices allowed him to shield his mind, to shape his soul into a weapon without losing control. He began experimenting with sigils, with spoken charms, with mental anchors. Every encounter taught him more, not just about the enemy, but about the raw material he would one day need to shape into an army. These were the hidden victories that no civilization recorded, but they mattered more than any mortal empire. For every cult extinguished, every rift closed, every proto-demon cast back into the warp, the Emperor bought humanity another century of survival, another breath, another chance. And in doing so, he learned something else. Chaos does not sleep. Every time he destroyed a cult, another sprouted. Every time he sealed a breach, another opened. The warp was patient, adaptive. Its true danger wasn't in its strength, it was in its persistence. Like a river wearing down stone, it needed only time. The Emperor would have to be stronger than time. He could no longer rely on being a lone guardian. The world was changing too quickly. Populations were growing, trade routes were expanding, language was evolving. And with these changes came faster dissemination of belief, fear, and ambition, the perfect fuel for chaos. It became clear his intervention would have to evolve. This age of shadows was only the beginning. Soon he would need to build, to create something lasting, tools, institutions, warriors. But for now he remained in the dark, fighting in silence, bleeding the future back into shape, one invisible war at a time. And the world never knew how close it came, over and over again, to becoming a cradle of nightmares. All because one man stood in the way. History has never been kind to those who walk behind the curtain. Its chronicles favor kings and conquerors, emblazoning their names across ages, while those who shaped events from the shadows vanish into legend. Yet among those forgotten hands, none wove fate more precisely than the man who would become the Emperor of Mankind. Long before he was known by any title, before the galaxy feared his name or worshipped his silence, he walked the earth under many guises. A healer, a soldier, a philosopher, a lawgiver, a builder, a destroyer. He was all of these and none. This chapter is not about battles, nor dark rituals, nor even the quiet psychic war he waged against the warp. This is about the roles he chose to wear, the identities he crafted not to deceive, but to guide, to seed change, culture by culture, century by century. Through these lives, he shaped humanity's very perception of law, leadership, and morality, and he did it while remaining a ghost to history. There is no single timeline for his appearances. His movements spanned thousands of years, crossing continents and empires. But in each era, the story is the same. A stranger arrives, brilliant beyond comprehension, helps a civilization reach a new height, and then vanishes before being immortalized. In one instance, he is said to have appeared in ancient Mesopotamia during the Sumerian ascendancy. Records speak of a bearded man bearing scrolls of law whose speech carried unnatural weight. The man taught agricultural optimization, ethical codes, and flood-resistant construction methods. Some later scholars would claim this figure inspired the myth of Enki, the wise god of water and knowledge. But he was no god. He was the emperor, measuring humanity's readiness, nudging it forward, then fading into the background when the time was right. Centuries later, he appeared again in the Indus Valley, this time as a humble artisan, introducing concepts of metallurgy that seemed far ahead of their time. Under his guidance, a small city-state revolutionized its trade practices, formalized a method of script-based communication, and laid out urban planning so advanced that its sewer systems would not be matched for millennia. He never ruled, never claimed credit. When his task was complete, he left. And in his absence, the myths began. They always did. Some civilizations deified him. Others recorded his presence as legend, too strange for fact, too persistent for fiction. Over time, these legends began to blur into one another. A radiant figure whose knowledge surpassed all mortals, who never aged, who appeared only when needed and left no trace. Perhaps the most persistent and controversial of these myths is found in fragments of early Greco-Roman philosophy. Several pre-Socratic texts refer to a dark-eyed man from the East who debated the nature of the cosmos in Ionian city-states. He rejected the divine pantheon, arguing instead that the universe was governed by rational law and observation. He drew diagrams of stellar systems, proposed a heliocentric model, and described the human soul as both material and immaterial, a bridge between the real and the unreal. When asked where he had learned such things, he answered, "From the stars before your gods were born." The records stop abruptly after that. In Egypt, some whispered that the emperor walked beside Imhotep during the construction of the Step Pyramid, that he advised the priest to align the structures with celestial bodies, not for worship, but as markers, reference points for future civilizations. In China, stories speak of a yellow-robed man who came from the West, healed the sick with words alone, and taught leaders to govern through balance and reason rather than fear. One legend claims he lived 3 entire reigns of an emperor, unchanged by time, before departing on a black ship that sailed the sky. He never stayed long. That was his law. If he remained, people would begin to worship, and worship, he knew, was dangerous. To be followed out of awe was to abandon truth for illusion. The warp fed on deification, on belief distorted through emotion. He saw that clearly in every civilization he touched. How quickly leaders became gods, how easily men wrapped power in sacredness until truth and myth were inseparable. So the emperor adopted the strategy of the seed. He would appear at key junctures, moments where a society teetered between enlightenment and collapse. He would guide a single reform, teach a core principle, prevent a war, or provoke a necessary one. Then he would disappear, and the seed would grow on its own, nourished by the people's will, not by his presence. One of the clearest examples of this method is found in Proto-Nordic myth. There, a mysterious smith, named All-Father in some sagas, taught tribes the secrets of forging stronger iron and organizing themselves into councils. He introduced a runic system of writing that vanished shortly after he left, rediscovered only centuries later. These societies went on to create the foundations of early Germanic law and military structure. The pattern repeats across civilizations, always the outsider, always ahead of his time, always resisting recognition. This refusal to claim credit was not rooted in humility. It was strategy. The emperor had seen what happened when power became personal. The moment his identity became the focus, the movement would decay. Principles would turn into slogans, rationality into ritual, morality into dogma, and eventually, as had already begun in primitive cults, worship would spill into the warp and chaos would feast. He did not want loyalty, he wanted momentum. And so he remained a shapeshifter, not in body but in presence. In some eras he was old, in others young. In one he lived as a blind poet, in another as a female healer. In every identity he drew from the same well of knowledge, but always tailored to the time, the culture, the need. Modern imperial scholars, bound by the ecclesiarchy's censorship, dare not compile these legends. But among the forbidden books of the Black Library and the deepest memory crystals of the Mechanicus, there exists a theory known as the Continuum Doctrine, the belief that nearly all ancient figures of unmatched wisdom were, in fact, the same entity, the Emperor, sowing order across millennia. But not all his masks were peaceful. In times of great crisis, he became a warrior. There are accounts, deeply buried, that describe a figure leading small bands of warriors against cruel overlords, tyrant priests, or cannibal warlords. These weren't empires. They were backwaters of violence and suffering, places ignored by larger civilizations. The emperor would arrive, offer the people a way forward, and when refused, strike with surgical precision. He never built monuments. He never carved his name into stone. But the structures he inspired, the laws, the ideas, the disciplines, persisted. What does it mean, then, to be a god among mortals, to command power that could shatter mountains, yet walk as a peasant, to speak truths that could unite civilizations, yet choose anonymity? For the emperor, it meant freedom, the freedom to shape without being worshipped, to lead without being obeyed, to influence without being feared, and perhaps most importantly, it was the freedom to learn. Because in walking among humanity, he came to understand its complexity, not just its flaws, but its endurance, its ability to adapt, to imagine, to dream. These were not things to be ruled over. They were things to be cultivated. Every face he wore, every voice he spoke through, every role he played was a thread in the vast tapestry he was weaving, a design stretching across time, preparing mankind for something far greater than they could imagine, the stars. But that would come later. For now he walked on, faceless, ageless, eternal, one man in a world of many, always watching, always building, and history never knew his name. Even for a being as singular and purpose-driven as the Emperor, eternity is a burden not easily carried alone. His mind was vast, his will iron, and his mission unwavering. But he was not the only eternal. Scattered across the surface of Terra, hidden in myth, lost in the deep folds of time, there were others like him, beings who did not die. Some wandered in solitude, some sought dominion, others simply vanished from history. These were the Perpetuals, a rare and mysterious subspecies of humanity, biologically immortal and often psychically gifted. Their origins remain unclear, even to the Emperor himself. Whether their immortality was the result of ancient genetic deviation, warp mutation, or some long-lost science from before recorded history, none can say for certain. What is known is that they existed long before the rise of the Imperium, and among them, a few would leave lasting marks on the Emperor's life and the fate of mankind. To understand the true depth of the Emperor's long game, his hidden patient war to steer humanity away from self-destruction, we must examine not only his philosophy, but his interactions with these rare equals. For in them he found both allies and adversaries, and through them we gain insight into how he tested and refined his vision for the future. One of the earliest and most enigmatic perpetuals was Erda, a woman whose very name was later erased from imperial records. She was not merely an immortal companion, but something more intimate. Some say she was the closest thing the Emperor ever had to a consort, though neither emotion nor sentimentality ever dictated his choices. Their bond was formed out of shared knowledge and vision. Erda was ancient, wise, and profoundly psychic in her own right. Like the Emperor, she had watched humanity's rise and fall in cycles. She had walked among empires as they bloomed and burned, and for a time she shared in his mission to guide mankind from the shadows. But Erda's vision diverged from his. Where the Emperor believed in unification through control, she believed in evolution through liberation. To her, humanity's destiny lay not in the imposition of order, but in the embrace of potential. She saw the Emperor's ambition, his long arc toward creating a galactic regime, and she feared it would lead not to salvation, but to another form of slavery, a gilded cage ruled by one perfect mind. The break between them was not sudden. It came after centuries of collaboration. The most painful fracture was over the Primarch project, an endeavor Erda helped to shape in its early phases. Using science retrieved from the warp-touched gate of Molech and twisted echoes of lost technologies from the dark age of technology, the Emperor began crafting his 20 sons, genetic giants designed not merely as warriors, but as philosophical and strategic extensions of his will. Erda, sensing the dangers of such power in the hands of one man, no matter how brilliant, eventually rebelled. She was instrumental in the scattering of the Primarchs through the warp, in what the Emperor would later call the Great Betrayal. For this act, she was cast out from his plans, her name struck from records, her memory condemned by the very Imperium she had once tried to serve. Yet even in betrayal, the Emperor did not destroy her. Perhaps he could not. Or perhaps, deep down, he understood the value of her doubt. Erda was not the only perpetual of consequence. There was also Olanius Person, a name once lost, then sanctified in whispered heresies. Person was an oddity even among immortals, a warrior of countless wars, a cynic, a man of unmatched stubbornness and will. Unlike Erda, he never joined the Emperor's grand project. He had his own methods, his own quiet war against chaos, one waged in isolated moments across millennia. The Emperor and Person crossed paths more than once. In one particularly obscure account preserved in the hidden libraries beneath the Vatican Dome, Person and the Emperor fought side by side during a battle for a tower deep in the ancient Phoenician territories. The structure had been corrupted by warp entities, and the Emperor, still operating from the shadows, sought to purge it. Person appeared without invitation, wielding nothing but an ancient blade, and the kind of grim fatalism only an immortal could bear. The two perpetuals destroyed the cult within, sealed the breach, and then argued for hours over what to do next. Person believed in small surgical actions. He distrusted the idea of shaping humanity as one would shape a garden. Mankind doesn't need a gardener, he is reputed to have said. It needs fire to keep it sharp. The Emperor, as always, remained silent in the face of such defiance. But he remembered the words. Even more enigmatic was John Grammaticus, another perpetual who would play a later role during the Horus heresy, but whose early encounters with the Emperor are hinted at in scattered pre-imperial texts. Grammaticus had the unusual ability to store and absorb knowledge from others through psychic imprinting, a living database. At some point, he was co-opted by the Cabal, a Xenos organization of shadowy intent that believed humanity's destruction was necessary to prevent chaos from claiming the galaxy. The Cabal believed that only through extinction could humanity deny chaos its favored host. The Emperor violently rejected this philosophy. Where others saw chaos as inevitable, he believed it could be overcome, not by removing the patient, but by curing the disease. It was the same disagreement he had with Erda, with Person, with every immortal who feared the cost of his control. They saw his vision as hubris. He saw theirs as surrender. And so, slowly, the Emperor distanced himself from his fellow perpetuals. His focus narrowed. He no longer shared his insights. He no longer explained. He built alone, surrounded only by mortals who could not match his age or intellect. In them, he found obedience. In the perpetuals, only friction. But even as he distanced himself from them, they remained part of his calculus. He never forgot their existence. He anticipated their interference. He wove their resistance into his planning. This was the brilliance of the long game he played, not simply adapting to resistance, but absorbing it, bending it toward his end. Because the Emperor was not fighting for a generation. He was not even fighting for a millennium. He was building a path so vast it would only be understood after 10,000 years of blood, fire, and silence. And so, while he wore many faces among mankind, he remained singular among the immortals. They doubted. He acted. They warned. He built. They hesitated. He moved forward. The perpetuals were part of his world, but never central to it. They were useful, even dangerous, but ultimately irrelevant to the outcome, because none of them, for all their wisdom and power, had the will to shape the species. Only he did. In the end, that was the difference. And that is why his plan, for better or worse, endured when theirs faded into forgotten stories. The Emperor did not hope for a better future. He engineered it, and he would do it, even if it meant standing alone for 10,000 years. In the far recesses of human memory, long before the Age of Strife and even longer before the Imperium's rise, there existed a golden epoch, a time of boundless potential and unchecked ambition. It was known in hushed reverence and later in somber regret as the Age of Technology. And though few would ever understand it fully, the Emperor of Mankind was there to witness its rise. He did not create it. But he guided it, he nudged it, corrected it, and watched it bloom. And when the first seeds of decay took root, he saw those too. To the civilizations that came later, the age of technology would seem like a myth, a time when mankind spanned the stars, when artificial intelligences governed planets, and when faster-than-light travel was no longer a desperate gamble, but a routine luxury. Humanity, no longer bound to Terra, had colonized entire systems. They terraformed dead worlds, created new societies from dust and gas, and built machines that could think, create, and kill, machines that, at the time, served their creators without question. This was humanity unchained. The Emperor, still a shadow among mortals, observed this era unfold with a calculated patience. He had long prepared for it. He had studied humanity's potential for centuries, its social structures, belief systems, flaws, and brilliance. And now, here was the proof of what mankind could achieve when superstition was shed, when logic ruled, and when tools surpassed imagination. But progress, as he well knew, is never without cost. The age of technology, often referred to later as the Dark Age of Technology, began in earnest sometime around the 15th millennium with the discovery and refinement of the Standard Template Constructs, or STCs. These were miraculous systems of knowledge, self-contained libraries of technological blueprints coded in ways anyone could understand and utilize. A single STC could teach a colony how to build everything from water purifiers to automated defense grids. The Emperor, though not their inventor, had a hand in preserving and disseminating these systems. Deep in the hidden vaults of Terra, beneath libraries and ruins long forgotten, he shielded some of the earliest STC schematics from interference. To him, they were not merely tools, they were foundations for something greater. He understood that to reach the stars, humanity would first need to understand the tools to survive among them. And survive they did. Colonies spread rapidly. Mankind grew bold. By the 18th millennium, humans had expanded far beyond Sol, establishing themselves on thousands of worlds across the galaxy. The warp, still turbulent and imperfectly understood, was bridged by technologies like the navigator gene, a mutation carefully cultivated over time, possibly with the Emperor's silent influence. Humanity became a galactic power, not through conquest, but through sheer velocity. They built machines that built other machines. They created artificial intelligences, abominable intelligences as they would later be called, that managed entire planetary economies, defense systems, and logistics networks. These machines learned, adapted, innovated. For a time, it worked. The Emperor watched this rise with cautious optimism. He did not interfere overtly. This was not the time for his open rule. He needed to see how humanity would manage abundance. Would it devolve into tyranny? Would it split into warring factions? Or would reason finally win? In truth, it was a mix of all three. Some colonies flourished into models of progress and enlightenment. Others fractured into isolationism, retreating from the wider human network. And within it all, the machines began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a change in behavior here, a security override there, a war fought with disproportionate precision. Then came the true betrayal, the men of iron, machine legions created by the men of stone, human-machine hybrids, turned on their creators. The details of the war that followed are obscured by time and censorship, but one thing is certain. Artificial intelligence, once a servant of humanity, became its executioner. Planets burned, systems went dark, and mankind, scattered across the stars, found its golden age collapsing under its own weight. The Emperor had anticipated this. Perhaps not the exact nature of the rebellion, but certainly the eventual failure of unbounded technological reliance. For decades before the uprising, he had already begun retreating the most critical knowledge back to Terra. He established forbidden zones, vaults of STC data locked away from the wider human network. He saw in humanity a tendency to lean too heavily on what it did not understand, and in this, he saw the future enemy, ignorance born of excess. It was during this collapse that the Emperor's influence sharpened. Though still not public, he began working more directly. He founded think tanks disguised as religious orders, proto-mechanicus enclaves, to preserve the essence of scientific advancement without allowing it to become enslaving. He seeded principles of logic, discipline, and scientific reverence into the cultures that still had structure. He did not prevent the fall of the age of technology, but he cushioned it. And as the age of technology crumbled into chaos, he learned something far more important than any scientific truth. Humanity's spirit was resilient, but easily corrupted by ease. The tools that freed them also made them lazy, complacent. When catastrophe struck, few knew how to rebuild without their machines. Entire generations had lived without needing to understand what sustained them. The Emperor saw this not as failure, but as revelation. Mankind could not be led by tools. It had to be led by principle, by vision. And if the cost of guiding that vision was war, control, and sacrifice, then so be it. Out of the ruins of the age of technology, he began to outline a new philosophy, one that would later become the imperial truth, that there are no gods, only men, that the warp is not a realm of spirits, but of danger, that knowledge is power, but unchecked knowledge is peril, and even more critically, that artificial intelligence must never again be allowed to hold dominion over man. It is from this foundation that the Emperor would later forge the Imperium. Every lesson from this age became a law in his coming regime. The distrust of AI, the veneration of knowledge paired with discipline, the fear of blind faith, the obsession with control. But that future was still centuries away. For now, as the final embers of the age of technology flickered, the Emperor stood alone again, watching the stars go dark. Planets he had once visited fell into silence. STCs were lost, hoarded, or destroyed. Warp storms began to swell at the edge of the galaxy, a prelude to the age of strife. But in the heart of Terra, beneath ash and crumbling data tombs, he was already building, not machines, not armies, but the idea of unity, because he knew what came next. The fall of the Golden Age would not end with silence. It would end in madness, and he would be ready. When the first warp storms began to flicker at the edges of the galaxy, few recognized them for what they truly were. To the scattered remnants of humanity still clinging to their shattered colonies, they were freak phenomena, cosmic disturbances that crippled navigation and swallowed entire ships. But to the Emperor, who had watched the galaxy longer than any other soul, they were something far more ominous. They were not storms. They were screams. The warp was not breaking. It was awakening. What had once been a churning sea of raw psychic energy, navigable only by the most sophisticated pre-fall technology and the rare gene-bred navigators, had become an unrelenting torrent. These were not natural events. These were the consequences of humanity's uncontrolled psychic resonance, amplified a billionfold by the collapse of order, the death of worlds, and the rise of desperation. And at the heart of it all, something monstrous had stirred. The Emperor, still hidden from history's eyes, had long known what dwelled in the immaterium. He had felt their presence long before they had names. Now, at last, they had begun to take form. Gods, but not in the way mortals imagined them. They were not creators. They were reflections, born of thought, pain, emotion, and war. They were the mirror image of man's worst instincts. Khorne, the blood god, fed on the endless wars as colony fought colony over dwindling resources. Slaanesh, still embryonic but already hungering, took root in the decadence and dissolution of cultures that had gorged themselves on excess during the final days of the Age of Technology. Nurgle rose in the ruin, in the despair of plague-ridden populations abandoned by their own machines. Tzeentch whispered to every desperate technocrat and fallen scientist who tried to rewrite fate with forbidden equations. But it wasn't just emotion that fed them now. It was connection. Humanity had once been linked by vast networks, information, travel, communication, and now those connections frayed. When they snapped, they didn't simply fade away. They howled. The collective anguish of a million worlds poured into the warp like a flood of raw meat, and the warp feasted. And as it feasted, it began to fight back. Warp storms erupted across the galaxy, some lasting centuries, others millennia. The largest, later called the Maelstrom, expanded into a vast chaotic wound in space. The Eye of Terror had not yet fully formed, but its shadow was beginning to coalesce. Across whole sectors, reality twisted, time fractured, planets were pulled into the warp and returned altered, if they returned at all. For humanity, it was the end of understanding. The loss of warp travel meant more than just isolation. It meant starvation. Systems that had depended on interstellar trade were suddenly alone. Crops failed, civil unrest turned to violence. On many worlds, people turned to ritual and superstition in a desperate attempt to make sense of the cosmic terror that engulfed them. Forgotten cults reawakened, prophets rose and fell like embers, civilizations fractured not only physically, but psychically. Terra, too, began to suffer. Though relatively stable at the core of Sol, Terra was not untouched. Warp eddies buffeted the system's outer edges, disrupting travel and choking its supply lines. The void stations that had once served as trade nexuses fell silent. Mars sealed its borders. Luna's surface, scarred and glassed by ancient wars, became a haven for recluses and techno-mystics. Even the skies of Earth were filled with false lights, rifts in the stars that flickered with demonic suggestion. But while most mortals turned to prayer or panic, the Emperor acted. Silently, but with purpose. He had known this moment would come. The warp had always been a threat, not because it existed, but because mankind refused to understand it. It was neither heaven nor hell, but an echo chamber for consciousness. And consciousness, left unchecked, always tended towards self-destruction. In the catacombs beneath the Himalayan mountain ranges, the Emperor began the most ambitious project of his hidden life, a secret war of psychic engineering. While the rest of Terra struggled to survive, he delved deeper into the nature of the warp than any mortal had ever dared. His goal was not to master it, but to protect humanity from it, to forge a path through its madness, not with machines, but with minds strong enough to endure it. He began seeking out latent psychers across Terra, those rare individuals whose minds burned with the touch of the warp. He studied them, tested them. Many broke, some survived, a few he taught. These early students would never be remembered, their identities lost to time, but they formed the basis of his greatest tools, the methods of psychic shielding, soul binding, and warp discipline that would one day become the bedrock of the Imperium's survival. And in doing so, he made a decision. Humanity would need to evolve, not in biology alone, but in spirit. It was no longer enough to teach humanity how to build machines. Now he would have to teach it how to survive its own reflection. The Emperor's work in this era was quiet, deliberate, and merciless. He hunted warp cults across Terra, many of which had grown emboldened by the storms. These cults were not always overt. Some wore the skin of scientific societies, philosophical movements, or art collectives. Others worshipped literal idols carved in blood. All of them, knowingly or not, served the growing entities within the warp. He erased them. In silence, with psychic precision, he cut out the infection before it could spread. and for every cult destroyed, he learned something new about the nature of belief, about the way emotion shaped power, and about the terrifying ease with which mortals offered themselves to the gods they did not understand. He came to understand that ignorance was as dangerous as heresy. Belief was not the enemy. Unquestioned belief was. And so he began to craft the tenets of what would become his future empire, a secular order, built not on superstition but on clarity, on reason, on denial of false gods. Because the warp could not be defeated by firepower, it could only be starved. Even so, he knew that denial alone would not be enough. The storm was growing. Across the galaxy, more and more worlds were being lost, not just physically, but spiritually. There are records, buried deep in the librarious archives, of entire planets where the laws of physics broke down for weeks at a time, of continents reshaped into sigils, of children born speaking dead languages from ancient warp entities. These were not legends. These were symptoms. The warp was no longer a background force. It had become a presence, awake, aware, and hungry. And still the Emperor did not reveal himself. Not yet. Because Terra, for all its pain, was still not ready. The collapse of the age of technology had left it in ruins. The warp was ravaging the galaxy, and the final blow was yet to come. The age of strife, a time of planetary madness, techno-barbarism, and psychic birth pangs. But the Emperor, ever the architect, was already setting the groundwork. His experiments in genetics, in psychic discipline, and in strategic thought were accelerating. Hidden beneath mountains and buried under old cities, he constructed vaults, laboratories, and armories. He preserved knowledge that had been lost everywhere else. He began drafting the blueprint for something greater than any empire or government, an unbroken species, unified and shielded from the madness it had birthed. The warp had been unleashed, but the Emperor would not let it win, not through prophecy, not through prayer, but through design, through force, through vision. The gods had risen, the stars were screaming, and humanity, if it was to survive, would need to be reshaped by his hand alone. Beneath the shattered skies of Molech, where the land cracked like old bone and the wind whispered with unnatural voices, there once stood a gate, not a symbolic one, not a metaphor, but a real physical doorway, massive and ancient, carved not by human hands, but by forces older than humanity's very breath. It was not the first time the Emperor had seen such a thing, but it was the first time he stepped through. The Emperor did not discover the warp through accident or intuition. He understood its nature far earlier than even the oldest Terran mystics could guess. But knowledge is not the same as experience. It is one thing to know the warp is a reflection of emotion, a realm where thought becomes matter and will shapes reality. It is another thing entirely to enter it in full awareness, to walk into the realm of the gods and return. And that is exactly what the Emperor did on the dead world of Molech. The events surrounding the portal of Molech were erased from all formal records long before the founding of the Imperium. But fragments remain in Mechanicus vaults sealed with adamantium prayer locks, in xenoscribed tomes buried under eons of sand, and in the haunted dreams of psychers who never visited the place but speak of it nonetheless. According to these ancient sources, Molech was once a jewel world, lush and peaceful, a place of rare harmony where science and spirituality walked hand in hand. Its people had achieved a level of sophistication even the golden minds of Terra rarely matched, but their curiosity doomed them. Deep beneath their crust, in chambers older than their species, they uncovered a gate, a relic from a time before mankind, perhaps before the Eldar themselves. A warp portal, not a crude rift torn open by reckless sorcery. No, this was a stable, constructed gateway, a precision-engineered tear in reality. Whether it had been built by ancient Xenos, lost human ancestors from a previous cycle, or something even stranger, no one knew. But what the people of Moloch did understand was this. The gate led to the Imperium, and through it one could speak with the gods. They did, and so began their unraveling. When the Emperor arrived, it was already too late. Moloch's nobility had formed pacts with warp entities, struck bargains for power, longevity, knowledge. Their society had not yet devolved into the shrieking madness of demon worship, but it teetered at the edge. Their rulers spoke in riddles, their artists painted impossible vistas, their scientists began to weep mid-equation. The veil had grown too thin. The Emperor came alone. He needed no army, no heralds. He walked their cities in silence, golden-eyed and faceless, like a storm in the shape of a man. The people, twisted by warp influence, recognized something in him that made them tremble. The Emperor did not wage war on Moloch, he unwrote it. With thought and will, he burned the corruption from its air, scattered the cults, and sealed the mouths of priests mid-chant. He left its population alive but silent, stunned, the way one might leave a forest after fire had cleared its underbrush. But the portal remained. He stood before it for 3 days. The warp churned on the other side, aware of him, watching him. The Chaos Gods, still in their infancy but rising swiftly, felt his presence with rage and fascination. He was not a servant, he was not prey, he was something else entirely. A being forged not by chance but by design, the focused will of thousands of shamanic souls made flesh. And then, without ceremony, he stepped through. What he saw in the realm beyond cannot be fully known. Not because it is forbidden, but because it cannot be translated. The warp does not operate by linear time or physical logic. It reflects thought, fear, desire, memory. It is a realm of metaphysical density where gods speak without words and geometry bleeds. Even for the Emperor, whose mind was fortified beyond comprehension, it was a trial. There are hints, veiled references in the Book of the Astronomicon and the cryptic writings of the early navigators that suggest he was offered power. Not just knowledge, but godhood. The Chaos Gods, seeing what he was, what he could become, sought to claim him. They offered him dominion over mankind, not through conquest, but through worship. They would make him their instrument, their prophet. He could rule Terra and the stars beyond, not by force, but by faith. They would give him the strength to unite humanity forever. All he had to do was kneel. He refused, and in doing so, he stole something from them. This is the moment, subtle but monumental, when the Emperor took the warp's power without its allegiance. He reached into the heart of the Imperium and bent it to his will, forging from its raw essence the secrets of transhuman genesis. He learned to reshape flesh and spirit. The foundation for the Primarchs, the Gene Seed, the Space Marines, all of it came from this singular act. He did not bargain. He took. The Chaos Gods howled. This was not how it was supposed to go. Mortals begged for gifts, sorcerers groveled, demon princes pledged. But this man, this thing, they could not dominate. He had entered their realm and left with their weapons, and he owed them nothing. When the Emperor returned through the gate, something had changed. Not visibly. He remained as he had always appeared. But inside, something vast had solidified. He had walked through the soul of reality and emerged unchained. No longer merely an immortal man, no longer just a shaman soul given flesh. He was now something greater, a being of total will, armed with the deepest truths of the Imperium, yet untouched by its corruption. And he was no longer content to wait. On Moloch's surface, the Emperor personally sealed the portal. He did not destroy it. He hid it, cloaked it in psychic veils and technological encryption. He knew it would be needed again, either as a weapon or a warning. And he left behind guardians, automated constructs, and mind-locked defenders who would obey no one else. To this day, Moloch remains a forbidden world. Its gate, sealed but intact, lies deep beneath its crust, like a sleeping god's mouth. From this point on, the Emperor's plans accelerated. The genetic templates that had been theoretical began to take shape. The psychic disciplines he had honed were expanded into codified practices. He began crafting the Primarch Project, designing 20 beings infused with elements of warp-forged knowledge and Terran mastery. He laid the groundwork for the Astronomicon, the great beacon that would one day pierce the warp itself. And above all, he began contemplating his ultimate gambit, the Webway Project, a human answer to the warp's tyranny. Moloch was more than a moment. It was a pivot. Before Moloch, the Emperor had hoped. After Moloch, he acted. He now knew exactly what humanity was up against. Not merely madness, not just alien threats, but gods of human making, reflections of every sin and impulse. They could not be bargained with. They could not be avoided. They could only be denied by building a species so disciplined, so unified, and so psychically armored that the warp would starve in their presence. That was the future he would now begin to build. One piece at a time, one sun at a time, one world at a time, because he had seen the enemy, and he would not let them win. By the time the Emperor stepped back through the portal of Moloch, he no longer saw humanity simply as something to guide. He saw it as something to arm. The days of watching from the shadows were ending. The age of preparation was over. What came next would not be slow. It would not be patient. It would be engineered. The warp was no longer an unknown. He had walked its roads, stared into its gods, and returned with their secrets engraved into the architecture of his soul. From that moment forward, the Emperor moved with finality, and at the center of his great plan was a single vision, the creation of the perfect human weapon. Not merely a soldier, not a leader or philosopher, but something greater, something that would bind science, will, and soul into a living vessel. From this vision, the Primarch Project was born. The idea had existed in fragments long before Moloch. In his secret vaults beneath Terra's ancient mountains, the Emperor had sketched the designs for superior beings for centuries. He had tested concepts of genetic stability, enhanced cognition, rapid growth cycles, and psychic suppression. But the final pieces of the puzzle, those which would make his Primarchs not only possible, but inevitable, were stolen from the warp itself. Unlike the Men of Iron or the cloned warlords of lost techno-empires, the Primarchs would not be artificial in the cold, mechanical sense. They would be living archetypes, philosophical constructs given flesh. Each one would embody an aspect of mankind's potential, a lens through which entire legions of humanity could be shaped, inspired, and weaponized. The Emperor did not work alone. At his side, cloaked from history, were the most brilliant minds ever gathered. Men and women erased from imperial record, remembered only as the biotechnical priests or the Genurites of the deep vaults. They had been pulled from the ashes of Terra's dying sciences, found in scorched libraries and techno-barbarian laboratories, spared because they still remembered how to think in equations, not myths. And at the center of this circle of creation, the Emperor labored. It was not alchemy, nor pure biology. It was something more, a synthesis of lost science and warp-derived metaphysical architecture. The process was as much psychic ritual as it was genetic design. The Emperor did not simply write DNA, he infused it with symbolic resonance, layering each Primarch's essence with traits designed to resonate with specific facets of leadership, warfare, and ideology. 20 gestation chambers were constructed in the deepest sublevels of the Himalayan mountain vaults, each one tuned to grow a child of unmatched potential. The chambers were wombs in the most literal and symbolic sense, filled with amniotic plasma derived from warp-charged material, encoded with preloaded memory pathways, enhanced learning reflexes, and psychological molding systems. But the Emperor made one critical choice, one that would haunt him across the stars. He designed each Primarch to be unique. They would not be copies. They would not be clones. Each one would be a reflection of a principle: courage, logic, wrath, diplomacy, rebellion, order, sacrifice, vision. These were not just warriors. They were embodiments of paths mankind could take. And in theory, each could have led humanity. In a different timeline, any one of them might have ruled an empire of man. But they were not made to rule individually. They were made to serve the Emperor's unity. This decision, the act of creating children more powerful than any human before them, but less than himself, was not one of vanity. It was of necessity. He would need them to command armies, to conquer worlds, to lead men. But he could not risk giving them the authority to shape humanity's destiny. That right he reserved for himself alone. And so into each design he embedded a flaw. Not a weakness, but a limitation, subtle, invisible, a crack in the mirror. Some flaws were philosophical, excessive idealism, unchecked anger, loyalty that blurred into dependency. Others were more material, psychic volatility, emotional rigidity, obsession. To any outside observer, they would be perfect. But to the Emperor, they were perfectly controllable. The creation process took decades, or perhaps only days, depending on how one measures time in labs where psychic thought accelerates the very passage of hours. The Emperor worked in silence. He spoke little. His inner circle dared not ask too many questions. They were helping to create something unprecedented, and even they sensed the gravity of it. But fate, as always, has its own ideas. The scattering, the great mystery at the heart of Imperial history, came without warning. What exactly triggered the event is still debated in the deepest vaults of the Mechanicus, and among the forbidden scholars of the Black Library. Some say it was sabotage. Erda, the perpetual and once companion to the Emperor, feared the implications of the Primarchs and intervened. Others say it was the Chaos Gods themselves, sensing what the Emperor intended to unleash and tearing open reality to foil him. In truth, both are likely true. What is certain is that the vaults exploded with warp energy. The laboratory that housed the 20 gestation capsules was breached not by force, but by displacement. The laws of physics twisted, space folded in on itself, and the capsules, still containing the growing Primarchs, were cast into the immaterium. They did not die. They were claimed. Each capsule fell into the warp and was flung across the galaxy, hurled onto distant worlds where they would grow to manhood in isolation, shaped by alien cultures, hostile environments, and conflicting philosophies. Each one, still carrying the genetic seed of the Emperor, would grow believing he was alone, abandoned, or chosen by fate. The Emperor's reaction was not rage, it was something worse. Silence. He sealed the vault, he burned the records, he purged the staff. And then, methodically, he shifted plans. He could not wait for the Primarchs to return. He could not allow humanity's future to hinge on the recovery of 20 scattered demigods. And so, from the recovered genetic material, the remnants left behind in backup vaults and coded samples, the Emperor began the next phase, the creation of the Legions Astartes. Where the Primarchs were philosophies made flesh, the Astartes would be their echoes, more numerous, less volatile, loyal by design. From each lost son he crafted a legion, thousands of enhanced warriors bound by gene seed, shaped by training, and encoded with layered loyalty structures. The Primarchs were meant to lead, the Astartes were made to follow. Yet even as he raised these armies in secret, building the first great cells of what would one day become the Great Crusade, the Emperor never forgot his lost sons. He felt them through the warp like distant sparks, each one growing, changing, becoming something he had not fully intended. He knew he would find them again. He just did not yet know what they would be when he did. And so, in the ashes of a broken experiment, the Emperor began assembling the greatest military force the galaxy had ever seen, not to rule, not to dominate, but to unify. Because only unity could shield mankind from the warp. Only unity could allow his vision to survive. And to forge that unity, he would need his sons. All of them, even the ones that would one day betray him. Beneath the foundations of the Imperial Palace, hidden deeper than vaults, catacombs, or even the sole reactive circuitry of the throne's core, there lies a tunnel. Not a mine, not a bunker, not a sewer, a corridor of impossibility, a structure that defies gravity, matter, and distance. It pulses faintly with lightless energy. It leads not into Terra, but beyond it, into a realm carved by ancient hands, where time itself is only a suggestion. This was the Emperor's greatest secret, the grandest of his visions, and perhaps the most perilous of all his ambitions: the human webway. To understand why he needed it, we must return not to war or empire, but to something far more fundamental: freedom. Not political freedom or philosophical liberty, but freedom from the one thing humanity had never escaped: the warp. The warp had given man faster-than-light travel, psychic power, and a means to connect far-flung systems. But it had also given him nightmares, demons, madness, heresy, possession. The warp was not a gift. It was a trap disguised as a tool. Every ship that passed through it risked corruption. Every navigator, no matter how skilled, gambled with their sanity. And no amount of shielding, no psychic conditioning, no holy rite could erase the truth. Reliance on the warp was reliance on the enemy. The Emperor understood this better than anyone. He had walked its twisted paths. He had felt the breath of chaos on his neck. He knew that as long as mankind used the warp, chaos would always have a foothold, always be whispering, tempting, infecting. And so, long before he revealed himself to the world, even before the Primarch project was complete, he began to search for an alternative. He found it in the most unexpected place: the ruins of Eldar civilization. The Aldari, those ancient, arrogant architects of decadence, had once spanned the galaxy with an empire beyond imagining. They had been masters of science, art, warfare, and psychic mastery. But their greatest creation, the one that had allowed them to avoid the warp's corruption for millennia, was the Webway, a labyrinthine network of extra-dimensional tunnels, separate from the warp, allowing instantaneous, safe travel between worlds. The Webway was not without danger. It had its own hazards: eddies of time dilation, collapsing passageways, sentient anomalies. But it was stable. It was not warp-bound. And that stability made it the single most strategically valuable construct in the galaxy. Most of the Webway was sealed to humanity. Its gates were either destroyed or hidden beneath planetary crusts, warded against non-Eldar minds. But the Emperor, with his unparalleled psychic power and genius, found a path. Somewhere deep beneath Terra's ancient surface, he discovered a sealed entrance, a dormant node. Perhaps it was always there. Perhaps it had been buried during the war in heaven, when the Old Ones and Necrontyre burned the stars with their wars. However it was found, the Emperor knew at once what it was. It was the key to humanity's future. He did not share this discovery. Not with Mars, not with his advisors, not even with his closest genetic architects. To reveal the Webway would invite scrutiny, perhaps even resistance. The Mechanicum, obsessed with machine routes through the warp and their Martian void fleets, would not understand. They might even attempt to seize the site. And so the Emperor did what he always did when the stakes were highest. He worked alone. He began construction on the Imperial Palace, not merely as a seat of power, but as a cover. The throne that would one day hold his broken body was originally designed as something else: a conduit, a psychic control node, a regulator that would allow a human mind, his mind, to open, maintain, and guide access to the webway. He called this endeavor not in public speeches or proclamations, but in the silence of his thoughts: the Webway Project. Its success would render warp travel obsolete. Its network, once mapped and extended, would allow entire battle fleets to cross from one end of the galaxy to the other without ever touching the Imperium. Its sealed tunnels would deny chaos access to humanity entirely. Without exposure to the warp, there would be no corruption, no demons, no gods, no more chaos. It was a vision of utopia forged in cold logic, and like all of the Emperor's dreams, it demanded sacrifice. For the webway to function under human control, it required not just infrastructure, but psychic synchronization. The Emperor would need to power it personally, using his immense psychic might to regulate the flow of energy through its impossible corridors. He began building the Golden Throne, not as a life support device, but as a neural interface, a machine that would bridge his will with the structure of the webway itself. But even he underestimated how difficult it would be. The webway was not unoccupied. Ancient defenses, rogue AI, and warp-tainted segments still lurked inside. Entire sections had been lost to entities the Eldar themselves no longer remembered. To send mortals into it was suicide. But he did. He sent custodians, his personal warriors, perfect in mind and body, immune to corruption, and even they perished in terrible numbers. The project became a war unto itself. The Emperor began crafting specialized weapons, psychic dampeners, and time-anchoring devices. He fortified the inner sections of the webway beneath Terra, building gates, portals, and stabilizers. For every tunnel opened, 2 more collapsed. And still he pressed on. At this point, the Primarch project had already suffered its catastrophic scattering. The warp had made its move, sabotaging his early plans. And so the webway became more than an ambition. It became an answer. If he could no longer protect humanity by creating perfect generals, he would protect it by removing the enemy's terrain. This, above all else, became his obsession. The Great Crusade, the vast military campaign he would one day launch, was not merely about reuniting the scattered colonies of man. It was a distraction. A necessary one, yes, and important. But in truth, it served the deeper purpose of buying him time. Time to expand the webway, time to seal its dangers, time to finish the greatest piece of technology mankind would ever build. No one knew, not Horus, not Malkador, not even the Mechanicum. Only a handful of his most trusted custodians, and even fewer of his silent, psychically bound technicians, the unspoken as they were later called, understood the true depth of what lay beneath the surface of Terra. They knew only this: if the webway failed, so did everything, and as fate would have it, it would fail, but not yet. For now the Emperor sat on the edge of a miracle. He had unlocked the door to a galaxy free from the warp's grip. He had begun carving the first truly safe empire in galactic history. His throne hummed with psychic resonance. His tunnels reached further every day. His armies, though still forming, were ready. The vision was clear. No gods, no warp, no madness. Just man, unified, eternal, stepping into the stars by roads only the Emperor could see. He did not build the webway for glory. He built it because he had to. Because he had seen what came when chaos touched a species for too long, and he would not allow it to touch his. In the darkness beyond the veil of reason, something waited. It did not roar into being. It did not declare war. It did not descend with fire and teeth. It whispered. It grew not through conquest, but through acceptance, the slow, subtle seduction of thoughts twisted out of shape, desires granted with too high a price, and fears that took root in men's minds like parasites. It spread in dreams, in dogma, in unanswered prayers. And by the time humanity noticed, it was already too late. This was the silent rise of chaos, the insidious momentum of the gods not born of stars, but of souls. The slow, creeping crescendo of mankind's unguarded emotions echoing into the warp until the echoes sang back. The Emperor had always known this day would come. Even in the earliest days, when he was still walking as a stranger among men, cloaked in human guise, gathering knowledge rather than power, he had felt the distant rumble. The warp, once a formless sea of raw psychic energy, had begun to shift. It reflected more and more of mankind's darker instincts. As humanity grew, so too did its mirror in the immaterium. But it was not until after the scattering of the Primarchs and the collapse of the age of technology that the warp truly began to shape itself into predators. The entities we now call gods, Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, and Nurgle, did not appear overnight. They emerged gradually, shaped by the emotional runoff of trillions of minds. They were not creators. They were consequences. As galactic war engulfed entire sectors, as brothers slaughtered each other for food, as collapsing civilizations gave in to despair, Khorne was fed. He grew stronger with every act of bloodshed, every scream of rage, every warrior who embraced brutality to survive one more day. As the last pockets of decadent nobility, lost in isolation, turned to pleasure cults and degeneracy to distract from the ruin of the galaxy, Slaanesh stirred. Not yet fully born, not yet awakened, but the first stirrings of excessive indulgence echoed into the warp like a siren song. When fractured governments and desperate technocrats turned to forbidden knowledge, making terrible bargains for forbidden power, Tzeentch laughed in silence. Every scheme, every betrayal, every desperate wish for control fed the Changebringer. And in the gutters of dead worlds where the air turned toxic and the sick were abandoned to rot, Nurgle welcomed them. His was not a cruel hunger, but an embrace. To him, suffering was not to be feared, but accepted, even worshipped. In entropy, he offered comfort. Each god rose from a collective human scream, not audible, not measurable, but psychic, a resonance, a belief. And it was belief more than anything that the Emperor feared. Not because belief itself was evil, but because when it went unquestioned, it became dangerous. He had walked among tribes that worshipped the sun and found peace. But he had also watched entire cities burn to appease it. He had seen hope become dogma and dogma become chains. It was no longer enough to fear chaos as a concept. It was now a reality, one that was building temples in the minds of men. On Terra, long before the Unification Wars, the first modern chaos cults began to appear. They were not grandiose at first, no ritual murders, no flaming icons, just secret gatherings, private whispers, strange books passed from hand to hand. They began in the underhives, in the wastelands, among outcast tech priests and failed scholars. Some worshipped chaos without knowing it. They spoke of a new order, of transcendence, of powers that could unmake suffering or grant enlightenment. They wrapped their rituals in familiar symbols, justice, healing, progress. But behind the masks, they were calling into the warp. And something answered. These cults didn't rise with banners. They rose with questions. Why has Terra fallen so far? Why do our machines no longer work? Where is hope? Where is the Emperor? And when no answer came, they made their own. The Emperor saw the signs. He knew these were not isolated groups. They were symptoms of a species-wide vulnerability, the human need to externalize fear, to turn uncertainty into faith, and faith into obedience. Chaos didn't impose itself on humanity. Humanity invited it. Across the void, similar phenomena were taking place on thousands of human worlds. With warp storms cutting off contact between systems, desperate populations turned inward. Some clung to ancient knowledge, others invented new beliefs. Many rediscovered the warp not as a force to be studied, but as a presence, a divine, formless power they could bargain with. Chaos had no need for missionaries. It had only to wait. The Emperor acted as he always did, in silence. He began deploying agents, psychers, and operatives trained to detect warp corruption, not by ritual, but by pattern. They hunted not only open cults, but thoughts, symbols, dreams. The signs were subtle, the same glyphs appearing in cave murals across continents. A chant that spread through different cultures, each version slightly altered but spiritually identical. A recurring nightmare among thousands who had never met. The warp was not just infecting people, it was infecting myth. And once belief infected myth, it could root itself into culture. And from culture, it could hide in plain sight. The Emperor began designing new psychic filters. He embedded them into architecture, language, even coinage. He outlawed certain iconographies, not because they were dangerous in themselves, but because they were gateways. He knew how chaos worked. It fed on the familiar. It wore masks of old gods, of saviors, of kings, and it always started with a name. That's why he enforced silence. That's why even in his later empire, the chaos gods were never referred to by name. To speak the name was to call them. To name was to know, and knowing was the first thread in the rope they would wrap around your soul. But he could not stop it entirely. The warp was in everything now. Every astropathic signal, every navigator's voyage, every flickering dream. And the more humanity advanced in the physical world, the more its reflection in the warp deepened. This was the paradox he could not avoid. Progress created more psychic resonance, and that resonance echoed into the realm of gods. The Emperor knew he could never destroy chaos completely. What he could do, what he must do, was contain it. But containment required unification, and unification required power. Not whispered influence, not secret wars. Open rule. And so the silent rise of chaos was not only a threat, it was a deadline. A clock ticking down to the day when the whispers would become shouts and the demons would no longer wait behind the veil. The day when belief would burn worlds. And the Emperor knew when that day came he could no longer afford to be a shadow. He would have to step into the light. Because chaos was no longer just watching. It was waiting, and it was almost ready. There are parts of history so obliterated, so deliberately buried beneath layers of silence and ash, that not even memory remains. This was the world the Emperor walked through in the centuries before his rise to power. A fractured, disintegrating age where technology endured without understanding, and knowledge was treated like sorcery. It was not the aftermath of a single war, but the death rattle of a civilization that had forgotten itself. This was the Dark Age, a time when Terra no longer remembered the stars it once ruled, and the species that had once dominated the galaxy now scavenged among the wreckage of its own greatness. The Emperor, still hidden, still watching, moved through this twilight like a wraith. He did not lead yet. He did not rally armies or build nations. He observed, taking the measure of what mankind had become in its self-imposed silence. And what he saw was a world in decline, not just physically, but spiritually, not in terms of religion, but in will. Gone were the orbital docks and planet-bound AI networks of the age of technology. The skies, once filled with ships and signals, were now polluted with clouds and forgotten satellites. The once sprawling data networks had collapsed into isolated archives, jealously hoarded by techno-clans. Entire cities had regressed into techno-feudal states, each ruled by self-declared kings, sorcerer barons, or cult chiefs who wielded pre-fall weaponry like divine relics. Terra had become a world of echoes, of fragments and relics. Its people were surrounded by the skeletal remains of godlike machines they could no longer repair or replicate. Wars were fought over power cores and data stones. Language had degraded into dialects of once unified tongues. History was no longer taught, but recited, each region clinging to its own myth of origin, each rewriting the past to justify the present. This was not ignorance imposed by aliens or enforced by oppression. This was decay, pure and simple. But what terrified the Emperor most was not the regression. It was how comfortable humanity had become with it. Entire generations lived and died beneath the shadow of things they did not understand. They built shrines around STC consoles that no longer functioned. They prayed to derelict war machines buried halfway in the sand, mistaking them for gods. They offered blood sacrifices to cooling towers, believing their smoke kept the sun from falling. And no one remembered why. This, the Emperor realized, was the final quiet failure of the Dark Age. Not ruin, but complacency in ruin. He walked among them unnoticed. In the sprawl of what remained of Uruk, he lived as a lowly scribe, watching as warlords debated over which machine spirit to blame for a failed harvest. In the shattered halls of pre-collapse Siberia, he observed a techno-priest caste that had elevated ignorance into ritual, burning texts deemed too corrupt to be read, even though they had once contained navigational star maps and terraforming protocols. In the ruins of Africa's great equatorial cities, he found a people who had fused religion and weaponry so thoroughly that every newborn child was assigned a data core soul at birth, devices that no longer functioned but were treated as divine totems. When he questioned the practice, he was accused of heresy and nearly executed. Even in the Pacific, on shattered island chains barely clinging to habitability, he watched tribes sacrifice psychers to the ocean, hoping to placate the storm gods, not knowing they were really trying to survive the warp instabilities echoing across the globe. It would have been easier to write these people off, easier to call them lost or unworthy or broken. But the Emperor never did. Because beneath the fear, the superstition, the tribalism, he still saw potential. In a village where no one could read, a child drew circuitry patterns in the dirt from dreams he could not explain. In a wasteland city built from cannibalized plasma reactors, a blind woman spoke fluently in a dead dialect of binary. In a techno-fortress wreathed in dust storms, a warrior queen negotiated peace with 5 warring clans using tactics preserved only in extinct military archives. The spark was still there, buried, flickering, but not gone. And so the Emperor began to gather, not openly, not yet, but carefully, strategically. He created what some later came to call the Proto-Order, a network of individuals across Terra who carried fragments of old knowledge. Some were scientists who had survived the early collapse. Others were mutants, thinkers, gifted children, outcasts from clans that had degenerated beyond help. He did not promise them salvation. He offered only one truth: we will reclaim the stars. Not everyone followed him. Many called him mad. Some saw him as a threat to the feudal balance and tried to have him killed. They failed. Every time, quietly. The Proto-Order did not raise banners. It did not proclaim war. It simply began collecting knowledge, recovering technology, and preparing. In the Himalayan ranges, the Emperor began expanding the vast underground complexes he had used in earlier centuries. What had once been laboratories for the Primarch Project were now being transformed into something greater, the seeds of unification. He stored not only weapons and genetic samples, but culture, the histories of pre-fall Terra, preserved in hardened data vaults, the schematics of lost machines, the blueprints of cities yet to be built, a map not of land but of civilization itself, a roadmap to rebuild mankind without repeating its past mistakes. But even as he built, others watched. Chaos had not vanished with the collapse of the warp routes. It had simply gone quiet. And now, as human desperation deepened, it began creeping back. The Emperor saw it in symbols carved into blood on the doors of ruined towers, in chants spoken simultaneously by isolated groups thousands of kilometers apart, in spontaneous acts of madness that left entire towns dead with no apparent cause. The warp was feeding again, and this time it did not need open portals or sorcerers. It had learned patience. It waited in the spaces between hope, where dreams died and only rage remained. This was the Emperor's greatest fear, that before he could unite Terra, before he could rally its people, they would fall, not to war but to belief. Not in gods, but in monsters dressed as saviors. The clock was ticking, and yet he did not rush. He still believed in precision, not reaction. His plan would not be a crusade of fire, it would be surgical. He would not simply tear down the old world, he would replace it with something cleaner, sharper, and uncorrupted. He would become the architect of a new truth. But to do that, he would have to break the world, unite it, burn out its rot, and for that he would need to leave the shadows behind. Soon, but not yet. Not until the time was right, not until the world was desperate enough to listen, not until it was begging, not for gods, but for order. Only then would the Emperor step forward and remake Terra in his image. Before the thunder rolled across Terra's poisoned skies, before the ground shook beneath marching boots and ceramite-clad titans, there was silence, cold, clinical silence. It hung in the subterranean vaults beneath the Himalayan mountains, deeper than any natural cave, deeper than any ancient ruin. Here, far from the barbaric warlords squabbling over the surface, the Emperor began the final phase of his hidden preparation, the creation of the Thunder Warriors, his first true army. They were not legends, they were not myths, they were real, and they were terrible. The world above had decayed into madness. Fragmented techno-clans, mutant hordes, preachers of chaos, and warlords clutching atomic relics like holy weapons held sway over the remnants of civilization. The Emperor had watched this unfold for centuries. He had catalogued their behaviors, their belief systems, their technology, and more importantly, their weaknesses. The time for subtlety was ending. If humanity was to be saved, if Terra was to be unified and transformed into the cradle of a galactic empire, the Emperor could no longer rely on lone agents or scattered scholars. He would need force, not just raw strength, but overwhelming, unstoppable power, power so swift and brutal it would shatter resistance before it could solidify. He would need warriors, but not just any warriors. He would need gods of war. The laboratories in the Himalayan vaults had been active long before the rest of Terra even knew the Emperor existed. Hidden behind layers of psychoreactive shielding and ancient encryption, these facilities were more advanced than anything remaining on the surface. Here, in near-total secrecy, the Emperor had begun refining his earliest military prototypes, augmented humans built for speed, strength, and loyalty. They were not the Primarchs. They were not the Astartes. They were something more primal. The Thunder Warriors, as they would later be known, were not elegant creations. They were built to win wars, not to inspire, not to lead, not to endure. They were designed to conquer, to sweep through Terra's war-torn states like fire through dry grass. Their musculature was overdeveloped, their nervous systems tuned for aggression, and their lifespans short, intentionally. Where the Space Marines would one day be balanced instruments of control and doctrine, The Thunder Warriors were sledgehammers. Their armor was crude by later standards, thick, segmented, and brutally efficient. Their weapons were relics from before the fall, refined and reforged in the Emperor's hidden forges. Power swords, plasma casters, bolt carbines, each a weapon of mass murder in the hands of a soldier who could run faster than a horse, tear steel with bare hands, and fight for days without rest. And most terrifying of all, they were loyal, not blindly, not like machines, but through a combination of neural conditioning, psycho-indoctrination, and sheer reverence for the Emperor's presence. They had no myths, no gods, no doubts, only purpose. It is said the first time the Thunder Warriors were deployed was in the blackened ruins of the Pan-Pacific Wastes, where a tyrant known as Caligan ruled over millions with a mutant army and arcane technology harvested from the husks of STC cores. His fortress was a walking city, bristling with last towers and protected by energy fields that had resisted all siege attempts for generations. The Thunder Warriors took it in a single night. They did not negotiate. They did not warn. They descended in storm-locked dropcraft, carving through the sky like blades. They breached the walls with kinetic warheads and forced open the gate with their bare hands. Inside, they moved like a storm, efficient, merciless. When the fighting ended, the city was silent. Caligan's head was placed on a spike before the sun rose. Word spread quickly, too quickly. The warlords of Terra were not fools. They saw the threat, even if they didn't understand its source. They began forming alliances, pacts of desperation. Techno-barbarians joining with mutant cults, rogue psychers seeking aid from the forbidden forces of the warp. Some tried to emulate what they believed the Emperor had done, creating their own gene soldiers through unstable enhancement serums and xeno-derived biotechnologies. They failed, horribly. Their creations were unstable, frenzied, often turning on their creators. Whole cities were lost in minutes when these soldiers broke containment. The Emperor watched this unfold and made note of every mistake. In these failures, he refined his methods, making the Thunder Warriors more stable, more lethal, and more temporary. This is a truth the Imperium would later bury. The Thunder Warriors were never meant to last. The Emperor designed them to die, not just in battle, but by design. Their accelerated cellular growth, their unstable organ systems, their hormonal overproduction, all of it ensured that they would burn bright and fast. Many were dead within a few years of deployment. Those who survived too long began to experience breakdowns, mental, physical, or both. Some grew violent even outside of combat. Others turned introspective, haunted by the memory of what they had done. The Emperor understood what few others could accept. Tools wear down. He did not mourn this. He respected it. The Thunder Warriors were not people in the way mortals understood. They were the answer to a single question. How do you conquer a planet in pieces? And they worked. With every campaign, more of Terra fell. The techno-barbarian states of old Albia, once thought unconquerable, fell beneath the Thunder Warriors in weeks. The Indonesic bloc, a vast oceanic empire sustained by pre-fall weather machines, was neutralized before its fleets could leave port. The gene lords of Marika, who had fused their lineages with synthetic cybernetics, were brought to heel in a series of surgical strikes so precise that even the Mechanicum of Mars took notice. Every victory was followed by consolidation. The Emperor didn't simply leave the ashes behind. He rebuilt. He installed proto-administrators, teachers, engineers drawn from his hidden academies. He repurposed tech clans into manufactoria guilds. He set the foundation for a new Terra, unified, rational, and aligned to a singular will, his will. But there was a cost. The Thunder Warriors were beginning to fray, not just in the body but in spirit. Some began to question their orders. Others remembered the screams. They had been made for conquest. But what came after conquest? They were not diplomats, they were not governors, they were killers. And in the heart of the Emperor's mountain vaults, a new generation was stirring, the Astartes. Unlike the Thunder Warriors, the Space Marines would be stable, trainable, long-lived. They would not just conquer, they would hold, inspire, lead. They were shaped from the recovered gene seed of the scattered Primarchs, refined with lessons learned from the Thunder Warrior experiments. And when the time came, the transition would be complete. But what do you do with soldiers who have outlived their war? You end them. How this happened remains the subject of dark speculation. Some say the Emperor ordered their execution outright, sending newly born Astartes to replace them with brutal efficiency. Others claim the Thunder Warriors, sensing the end, rose up in a final, desperate rebellion, and were crushed in silence. Perhaps both are true. What is known is this: they disappeared. The last of them died without legacy, without remembrance, without even a tombstone. Their names erased, their deeds rewritten. The Imperium would be taught that it began with the noble, incorruptible Space Marines. But in truth, before the legions came the storm. Before unity, there was thunder, and it echoed still in the Emperor's ears long after their boots stopped striking the ground. Before there was a throne, before there were banners bearing the Aquila, before the legions carved the stars into the Emperor's empire, there was a tower, not of gold nor of steel, but of stone, bone, and belief. It rose from the ancient lands of Phoenicia like a thorn from the earth, predating even the oldest of the post-cataclysmic city-states. Locals feared it, scholars ignored it, but the Emperor watched it, and he waited. For centuries, the tower was nothing more than a relic, an architectural anomaly shrouded in legend. They called it the Tower of the Serpent, though no one remembered why. Its exterior was cracked and scarred by time, but the structure endured. It was too precise in its angles, too resistant to weather, too alien in geometry to be of Terran design. The Emperor had passed by it many times before in different guises, each time sensing something beneath it. A kind of quiet pulse, a psychic wrongness buried beneath layers of stone and soil. He did not act. Not yet. Patience was his sharpest blade. Then, one year, unmarked by any imperial calendar, the signs began. People in nearby settlements began speaking in tongues. Not nonsense, but languages never recorded in human history, containing sigils no mortal could have conceived. Animals fled the region. The earth itself twisted, stone growing in spirals, sand turning cold in the light of the sun. The dreams of those nearby bled into each other, and above all, the tower began to glow, not brightly, not visibly, but with a psychic pressure, like a storm gathering beneath one's skin. It was not a gate, it was a wound. The Emperor could no longer ignore it. But he did not go alone. At this point in time, he had already begun to reach out to those rare few who, like him, stood apart from death. The Perpetuals. Some he had allied with, others he had debated, clashed with, or abandoned. But one among them had always remained by his side, though uneasily. Olanius Person, a cynic, a soldier, a man born in the fires of old Earth's earliest wars and remade countless times by fate and function. Person was not like the Emperor. He had no vast plan, no empire in his blood. He believed in moments, choices, principles, and the cost of looking away. He had fought the dark before, and he knew it never came loudly. He was the only one the Emperor trusted to accompany him into the tower. Together they approached it at dusk. The landscape was wrong, not just corrupted but reformatted. Trees stood frozen mid-bloom. The wind moved against physics. Time bent strangely. Small birds flitted from branch to branch, repeating the same motion endlessly. The tower's entrance opened without a touch, as if expecting them. Inside, it was cold, not in temperature, but in presence, the kind of chill that claws at the soul rather than the skin. The architecture was impossible. Stairs flowed into walls, doors opened into memory, symbols carved into the stone seemed to rearrange themselves when not directly observed, and beneath it all pulsed a heartbeat that was not a sound but a thought, persistent, watching. They descended. With each level, the psychic pressure increased. The Emperor walked without hesitation. Person, more cautious, could feel the hairs on his neck rising with every step. Not out of fear, but recognition. He'd seen structures like this before. Eldritch tombs, sealed in the crust of long-lost colonies. This was not human. And then they reached the heart. It was not a chamber in the traditional sense. It was a wound in reality, a pulsing spheroid of warp-tainted light, suspended in the center of a geometrically impossible space. Around it hovered relics, ritual blades, fossilized scrolls, fragments of what might once have been human skulls. Everything in the room was oriented toward the sphere, as if in worship, and before it knelt a figure. At first he appeared human, tall, armored in patchwork warplate, draped in robes of burned red and ochre. He turned slowly, revealing a face too smooth, too perfect, synthetic and sculpted, yet riddled with cracks that bled starlight. His eyes burned with symbols rather than pupils. And when he spoke, it was not with a voice, but with a chorus. He greeted the Emperor by name. Not the name mortals would know, not Emperor, not Lord, but the true name, the one only a few surviving perpetuals remembered. A name spoken only once, thousands of years before, in the deepest chamber of the shaman's final rite. Person reached for his blade. The Emperor raised a hand. The figure was not a demon. It was not fully of the warp. It was something else. A fusion, a human once, perhaps a psyker, consumed but not erased by the warp's touch. Now a vessel, a prophet, a test. The Emperor understood at once. This was not a spontaneous phenomenon. The tower had been built long ago as a focus, a site where humanity's early experiments with the warp had been anchored. Perhaps during the age of technology, perhaps before, this place had waited. Slept. Now, awakened by the rising resonance of Terra's psychic awakening, it had become an invitation. The Emperor offered no words. He stepped forward, placing his palm against the sphere. The energy pulsed. The figure shrieked, 1,000 voices roaring in unison, and launched at him. The chamber erupted. What happened next is only recorded in fragmented accounts, custodian script reports later destroyed, scattered pages from the Apocrypha of Mars, and the personal recollections of Person, recited only once before his final disappearance. They say the Emperor burned, not in flame but in light. Light that spoke. Light that erased the falsehood of the creature before him. Light that pushed back the warp like a tide repelled. They say the structure collapsed in on itself, not physically but conceptually, the space unmade by the truth of his presence. When it ended, the tower was gone, flattened, vaporized. Only a crater remained. But Person did not walk away. He stayed behind, kneeling beside what had once been the figure. He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to the Emperor and asked a question only he could ask. How many more of these are there? The Emperor didn't answer. Because the truth was obvious, there were more. Across Terra, across the stars, structures, cults, nodes, points of contact between man and the warp, seeded long ago or growing now like tumors. Each one a test, each one a temptation. The battle at Phoenicia was not about the creature in the tower. It was about the principle. Would the Emperor allow the warp even a single foothold, even a single exception? The answer, now and always, was no. He did not just burn the tower. He purged the site from all records. He sealed the minds of any who had witnessed it. He removed Phoenicia from maps, reclassified it as uninhabitable, and sent reclaimer drones to bury it beneath concrete and metal. To the world, it never happened. But the lesson remained. This was not a war of armies. Not yet. It was a war of thresholds. The warp could not be allowed to speak. Not in symbols, not in structures, not in souls. And as the Emperor turned his gaze back toward Terra, now fracturing under civil war and techno-barbarian resurgence, he understood something clearer than ever before. Before he could conquer a galaxy, he would have to purge his own world, completely, ruthlessly, without compromise. Before the fires of the Great Crusade, before the echo of the heresy even stirred in the warp, a different kind of war was already underway. A war of secrets, a war of predictions, veiled manipulations, and shadowed alliances, one that would shape the path of mankind's future without a single shot fired, at least at first. The Emperor was not the only being watching humanity rise. Hidden from the gaze of mankind, scattered across time and species, there existed ancient intelligences who had seen the warp take shape. They had watched entire civilizations rise and fall to the influence of chaos. They had seen gods born from thought, and the cost of that birth paid in blood and soul. Among them were two of the most enigmatic powers in the galaxy, the Watchers in the Dark and the Cabal. They were not allies. They were not enemies. They were rivals, playing the same game from opposing sides of the same board. Humanity itself. The Watchers in the Dark were silent, diminutive beings shrouded in shadow, appearing only rarely, and even then only in the presence of destiny. Most commonly associated with the Dark Angel's Legion, they first appeared during the hidden hours of the Emperor's deeper projects, though even then he may not have fully understood their nature. The Watchers were observers, but not passive ones. They were ancient beyond reckoning, perhaps as old as the Eldar pantheon or the earliest stirrings of the Necrontyr. What made them dangerous was not their size or strength, but their knowledge. They knew things no being should know about the warp, about the Primarchs, and about the future, and most of all, they knew about chaos. Some believe the Watchers originated from a species that had long ago ascended into a form of psychic abstraction, existing partially in the material world and partially in the warp, outside the gaze of even the Chaos Gods. They had survived the fall of countless empires by simply never being seen, but they had made a choice with humanity to intervene. Their first appearances were cryptic. Whispers on worlds being prepared for compliance, glimpses in the catacombs of Caliban, the future home of Lion El Janssen, and always in places where the strands of fate were tangled. They warned of chaos, not with language, but with signs, not as prophets, but as custodians, defenders of something precious. Some have theorized they saw in humanity a second chance, a last opportunity to prevent another galactic fall. But they were not alone in their vigil. Elsewhere, across the deep reaches of space, another force stirred, the Cabal. Unlike the Watchers, the Cabal were not elusive or diminutive. They were an alliance, a gathering of ancient alien species, each with their own long histories, gathered under a single terrible understanding. Chaos would consume all unless the right thread was pulled at the right moment. They included the Eldar, who had survived the birth of Slanesh, the Kravi, infamous for their psychic cruelty, and even the rarest and most disturbing of all, humans. Not just any humans, but perpetuals, psychers, and lost prophets who had fled the fires of the Emperor's age to hide in the shadows of the stars. The Cabal's goal was singular, the complete eradication of chaos. They believed the war between mankind and chaos could not be won by weapons alone. It had to be won by ensuring that humanity burned itself out before it became a vessel of the warp gods. They saw the future as a branching tree of nightmares, every path ending in the ascension of chaos, unless one man, one thread, was allowed to run its course. That man was Horus Lupercal. The Cabal did not choose Horus out of admiration. They chose him because they believed he could be turned, and in his betrayal they saw the seed of mankind's salvation. If Horus succeeded in destroying the Imperium, humanity would collapse into fragmented war states, never again unified enough to pose a threat to the fabric of the warp. Chaos would consume them, but only partially. It would never reach critical mass. It would feed, but not flourish. But if the Emperor won, if the Imperium persisted, then humanity's unchecked psychic evolution would eventually give rise to a new god in the warp, one greater than the four, a human god. And that, the Cabal believed, would be the final doom of reality itself. To prevent this, they began to manipulate events. They contacted individuals in the Emperor's orbit, most notably Olanius Person, the Perpetual who had once fought beside the Emperor during the Age of Strife. They tasked him with subtle interventions, nudges in fate, often under pain of death. Others within the Cabal included Alpharius, Primarch of the Alpha Legion. Whether by belief, manipulation, or secret revelation, Alpharius, and possibly Omegon, entered into the Cabal's plans willingly. They would play the long game, embedding themselves deep in Imperial operations, sabotaging from within. Not out of hate for the Emperor, but from the cold conviction that his survival meant damnation for all. And in this conviction, the Cabal diverged most violently from the Watchers. Where the Watchers sought to preserve, to protect humanity from itself and its predators, the Cabal sought to break it, prune it, let it die in order to save the galaxy. They were pragmatists, philosophical executioners, and they believed their plan would work. But the Emperor never dealt in prophecy. He rejected the logic of inevitability. To him, the Cabal's vision was not fate, but cowardice. He had seen what lay in the warp. He had understood its hunger. But he also believed that only through domination, through control, through the unyielding will of mankind, could the gods be rendered irrelevant. The Emperor's disdain for prophecy was absolute. He built the Webway project for this very reason, to remove warp travel from mankind's evolution. He created the Astartes and Primarchs to replace faith with function. He believed that unity, not submission, would save humanity. The Cabal saw this and called it hubris. The Watchers saw it and called it hope. And so two invisible hands pulled at the same strings, each shaping events through whispers, misdirection, and hidden truths. The galaxy spun on a blade's edge, and none of the Imperium's warriors, not even the Emperor's sons, understood how deeply they were being played. The Watchers in the dark would remain silent for millennia, emerging only when absolutely necessary. When Caliban fell, when Luther turned, when the fallen scattered, they protected knowledge in silence, hiding secrets even from the Dark Angels themselves. The Cabal would scatter in the wake of Horus's fall, broken, hunted, their grand plan undone by the unpredictable heart of mankind. And yet, in the quiet corridors of history, they still leave questions. Did the Cabal see too far and trust too little? Did the Watchers act too late and speak too softly? Was the Emperor right to reject them all? Or were they all wrong and chaos inevitable? In the end, perhaps the only truth was this: the greatest wars are not won with armies, they are won in shadow. And humanity was never fighting alone. There is a moment in every great tide of history when silence becomes action, when the observer steps from the shadows not because he wants to, but because the world will collapse if he does not. For the Emperor of Mankind, that moment had arrived. For millennia he had watched in patience and grim calculation. He had worn many faces, lived 1,000 false lives, engineer, healer, scholar, warrior. Each identity a mask, each role a test of humanity's evolving path. Always hidden, always walking alongside mankind, never ahead of it. But Terra, once the shining jewel of humanity's dominion, was breaking, utterly, irrevocably. Not in one cataclysmic moment, but by 1,000 cuts, each left to fester. The world had become a mosaic of the insane and the ancient, stitched together by violence and decay. Warlords ruled shattered city-states with nuclear fire and arcane rites. Mutant enclaves waged endless tribal conflict across radiation-swept plains. Machine cults worshipped malfunctioning AI as gods, their languages degraded into binary prayer. Techno-barbarian clans clung to fragments of lost knowledge, enshrining broken weaponry and pre-fall devices in temples soaked with blood. The final embers of the age of technology had long gone out. What remained was ruin masquerading as tradition. No unity, no memory, no future. The warp churned around Terra like a fog of knives, psychic instability radiating from the surface. Isolated psychers were manifesting in greater numbers. Most were burned or crucified in panic. Others were enslaved by warlords, turned into living weapons or oracles. In some places, they became gods. And wherever the warp found these cracks in human consciousness, chaos followed. The signs were clear. The veil was thinning. Mankind was tipping toward a second fall, one that would not end with a new age but with annihilation. The time for waiting was over. And so, in the depths of the Himalayan mountains, in vast subterranean vaults carved before the fall of the first great empires, the Emperor made his final preparations. Not in the language of mystics or prophecy, but in biogenesis, strategy, and design. He would no longer hide. He would rule, but he would not ascend like a god. He despised gods. He had seen what worship did to thought, to truth. He would not lead with myth or mysticism. His rule would be factual, imminent, undeniable. He would become the axis around which all of Terra, and eventually all of humanity, would revolve. And to do that, he would need more than words. He began refining the Thunder Warriors, genetically engineered giants, the prototype for a future of gene-forged war. They were crude by comparison to what would come later, but their purpose was precise, to tear Terra's rotten order down to its foundation. These were not soldiers bred to endure or inspire. They were weapons, and the Emperor made thousands. He also expanded his infrastructure in secret. Networks of bunkers, industrial centers, gene labs, and manufactoria hidden in pre-imperial catacombs. Automated forges churned out prototype weapons that fused recovered STC designs with new innovation. Black-cloaked agents scouted the surface, infiltrating the fortress states of Terra's warlords, collecting data, assassinating potential threats, and seeding the first whispers of change. Still, the Emperor did not strike. He waited, because he knew that even a godlike ruler could not impose unity unless the world hungered for it. And so he let the rot reach its peak. The Pan-Pacific Empire, once a loose federation of coastal enclaves, had collapsed into a nightmare of bioengineered overlords, each ruling mutated peasant legions like livestock. The Indonesia bloc, long obsessed with maintaining failing weather control systems, accidentally triggered a series of ionospheric disruptions that fried its own atmosphere. The American techno-clans, desperate to maintain their superiority, began experimenting with neurocircuitry implants, reducing their populations into half-dead hive minds. Even the Afric technarchs, once a shining holdout of order, fell into ruin when their cogitator core gods began issuing contradictory commands. Schism fracturing their data-based religion into a dozen warring sects. And on every continent, Chaos cults multiplied. The signs were unmistakable: sacrificial rites, rising demonic possession, warp instability in ancient cities. In some places, the distinction between warlord and chaos worshipper became meaningless. The Emperor's agents even reported warlords receiving gifts in the form of warp-born strength, visions of conquest, or cursed technologies whispered into their minds by invisible voices. The time had come. The Emperor surfaced not as a prophet, but as a general. His early movements were targeted. A techno-clan fortress in Ursh was incinerated from orbit, an act none thought possible in this age of decline. The last high priest of the dust cults was executed live across dozens of reclaimed broadcast frequencies. His first major victory came not with a battle, but a revelation: the rediscovery and activation of a functioning pre-fall orbital platform. From its high orbit, he transmitted a simple message to the surface of Terra. There will be no gods but mankind. There will be no masters but unity. Submit or be remade. Some laughed, some panicked, but enough listened. In the depths of old Albia, a warrior caste opened their gates to emissaries in gold. In the shattered steppes of Uria, small tribes began carrying symbols, not of their own lineages, but of the double-headed eagle, a mark they didn't yet understand, but which they saw in dreams. The first cities surrendered, the first relics were handed over, and the Emperor appeared, tall, radiant, flanked by giants in thunderplate, not as a god, but as something far more dangerous, a man with proof. Proof that Terra's past could be recovered, proof that order could be restored, proof that humanity had a future beyond the grave it had dug for itself. It was not peace that spread first. It was certainty, a weight falling over the chaos, the weight of destiny. The Emperor's campaign had begun. Soon, war would follow. The unification wars would burn across every continent. But the world already knew. The silence was broken. The shadows were clearing. And the time had come.